Hey guys, welcome back. I'm happy to be back with you all. This is This Country Girl's Life. We're covering true crime and trials over here. And it's been a while since I've been here, but I am back. And I just want to let people know, especially if you're new here, I have a lot of animals. We have our mascot, Steve, who is a house chicken. He doesn't have feet, so he lives in the house, and you might hear him in the background. And we are now up to 13 dogs, and it's kind of cool and raining outside. So you may hear some dog noise in the back because they are really wound up today. We also have goats now and a miniature cow, and yeah, it's like a whole thing out here now. But I am back, and today we are going to go over the Karen Reed murder trial. I'm assuming if you're watching this video, you probably know what it's about. Karen Reed was John O'Keefe's girlfriend. This is Officer John O'Keefe. He was a Boston police officer, and he died in 2022. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts has charged her with murder, saying that she backed into him deliberately, leaving him in a snowbank to die in a blizzard. Obviously, she's saying that she didn't do that. It's caused a big rift in Boston. You've got the Free Karen Reed people, and they all think she was framed by the police, and then you have the people that think she did it. So I deep dived the case before it went to trial, and I have opinions, I have thoughts, but I'm trying to go into this trial with an open mind, like how a juror would look at it, or how if I was a juror I would have to look at it. And I gotta tell you, the first week, I feel like the defense did a better job so far. But I'm gonna watch it. I'm not gonna stream it. But I am gonna watch it, and I will probably do either bi-weekly or weekly updates of just kind of what happened, just sort of the highlights, the rundown, who testified, what they said, things like that. And then I will give you the observations that I make. You know me, I take notes. This is just from week 1, and they had a day off. They had 2 half days, and they had a jury view, and I got that many notes. So let's just kind of dive in. I'll give you a little bit of background in case you don't know. If you don't, just Google Karen Reed and you'll find out. As I said, John O'Keefe was her boyfriend, Boston police officer. They went out, they had been at a bar and left that bar, went to another bar. At the bar was a guy named Chris Albert, who's John's neighbor, a guy named Brian Albert, that's Chris's brother, who is a Boston police officer, and Jennifer McCabe, who is Brian's sister-in-law. And there's so many people in this case that it's overwhelming. But I'm going to try to help you through that. That's why I'm going to do it just week by week and kind of let you know who all these people are and how they're connected. So at last call, Brian Albert said that he was going to go home and have a beer with his son for his birthday. It was his son's birthday. And he invites, it's kind of an open invitation to the whole group, like, hey, if you want to come by, come by. So John O'Keefe wanted to go by, and Karen Reed didn't want to go and stay. So she took him to Brian Albert's house and dropped him off, and she left and went back to Officer O'Keefe, and, well, it was just Officer O'Keefe's house that she was staying at. And it's kind of important to know, Officer O'Keefe, I'm not sure if he adopted, but he was the legal guardian of his niece and nephew. His sister passed away. I believe she had cancer. And then 2 months later, her husband passed away. And John O'Keefe was raising those kids. So the boy was at a sleepover on this particular night, and the niece was there, and Karen went back there, and she fell asleep. So she wakes up about 4:30 in the morning, and she realizes John hasn't come home, and she's kind of freaking out. So she wants to call Jen McCabe, but she doesn't have the number. So John O'Keefe's niece is close friends with McCabe's daughter, so she wakes her up to get the phone number. And McCabe doesn't know where O'Keefe is. So Jennifer McCabe calls Chris Albert's wife, and Chris Albert's wife is Julie, and Reed calls O'Keefe's friend, who her name is Carrie Roberts, and her and John were close friends. So Karen Reed, Jen McCabe, and Carrie Roberts meet at McCabe's house. They get into Robert's car to go look for O'Keefe. Now, Karen had previously backed out into the driveway, and they have a camera so you can see it. And it really appears that she hits John's car that's parked outside. But that's one of the things that's kind of in question, because this really comes down to a broken taillight. Is that when she broke the taillight, or did she break the taillight when she hit him? So she tried to go out, but it was a blizzard. So she didn't really want to drive on the street. So she called, and all these ladies are like, okay, we'll get together and we'll go. So they get into Carrie Roberts' car and they go to look for John O'Keefe. Karen Reed spots O'Keefe laying in the snow outside of Brian Albert's house. Now, her attorneys are named David Yannetti and Alan Jackson. And they're amazing, especially Alan Jackson. His cross is unmatched. Love that guy. There is a name that's going to come up a lot, and it's Trooper Michael Proctor. He is a Massachusetts state trooper who was in charge of the criminal investigation. But as we go, you're going to learn that he has all of these people have all these ties together, and it really makes you wonder what is going on in the background. And this guy is being investigated. He's under, I think it's a federal investigation. I know the DA's office is being investigated in a federal investigation. It may just be internal affairs for Michael Proctor, but he also is being investigated. So in the arrest report, I'm sorry, that's Bandit in the background. Karen Reed told Jen McCabe she last saw O'Keefe at a bar. She and O'Keefe had gotten into a fight. She didn't remember dropping him off at Brian Albert's. Carrie Roberts' account was that Reed was so drunk that night that she told Roberts in the morning that she didn't remember anything from the night before, though she had wondered if O'Keefe was dead or got hit by a plow. And Karen Reed still seemed drunk that morning. That's according to Carrie Roberts, who is John's friend. Before they found Officer O'Keefe, Karen Reed showed Roberts and McCabe her cracked taillight, saying she had no idea how it happened the night before. When the emergency responders show up on scene, you'll see that they all kind of give testimony as to trying to find out what happened to... Hold on. Trying to find out what happened based on his injuries, and they all have some sort of version of Karen Reed basically saying she hit him. So that's just a little bit of the background. I could do a whole video of nothing but the background on this case, but it's all going to come out, so we're just going to take it as it comes. So I'm going to take this down, and we're going to go into day 1. Okay, so this is the prosecutor. His name is Lally. His opening statement, I've seen like on Court TV, Law and Crime, other attorneys that, you know, kind of did a recap review of opening statements, and lackluster is the word that I kept hearing over and over and over. And I agree. This guy had no passion about what he was saying. He's not a good storyteller. He's hard to follow at times, and you'll see when he's questioning somebody, he has a hard time staying like on a straight path. You'll be talking about something, and then he'll be like, wait, let's go back. Okay, now let's go back. It's hard to keep up with. It was really hard to stay interested. I don't know how the jury did it. I just kept waiting for it to be over. I didn't feel like I really got a lot of information about really anything. You know, he's throwing you all these names, but he's not really explaining who's who, and it just was not a good start for the Commonwealth's case. And then that's Karen Reed up in the corner. Her attorney, David Yannetti, did the opening for them. He was fantastic. The first thing he said, he walked up there and said, Karen Reed was framed. Just like that. Like he yelled it. Very passionate in his opening statement. He is a great storyteller. He really keeps you interested. He's easy to follow. Started raising reasonable doubt from the jump. Now, of course, this isn't evidence, but he's planting those seeds in the heads of the jurors, and he did a fantastic job. He gave a lot of bombshell information about Michael Proctor in particular that was just wow. The first, let's see. Actually, before we go to that, I want to go here. So in his opening statement, this is David Yannetti for Karen Reed. He said that Karen Reed was framed and did not kill John O'Keefe. He promised the jury it wouldn't take long for them to question the reliability of evidence or the witnesses in the shoddy and biased investigation led by the Massachusetts State Trooper Michael Proctor, who Yannetti said trained his sights on Reed because of his personal ties to the Albert family. Hold on. I'm so sorry. Like I said, there's a lot of connections. I believe Proctor is the one, he was in one of the Albert family's weddings. There's pictures of him at the reception. I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy. Yannetti said that he had texts from the lead investigator, Proctor. Now think about that. This is the guy that's investigating what happened. He was sending texts to his high school buddies, and he was going through Karen Reed's phone before he even had a warrant to do so. And he said he, quote, hoped Karen Reed would kill herself. And he was trying to find nudes of her on the phone and was disappointed when there were none. He also called her a see you next Tuesday. And someone had texted him and said, man, the homeowner is going to catch a lot of grief. And he responded with, nope. And this is why. He said the owner of the home where O'Keefe's body was found would not catch grief because he too was a Boston police officer, so nobody was even going to look at him. Yeah. Yannetti said Proctor never searched inside the home for signs of a struggle. The Albert home to this day has not been searched, which is crazy. The lawyer accused Proctor of falsifying a report to give the wrong time for when he impounded Reed's car. And that's really important. It's like an hour and a half difference that they had the car to do whatever with. And they weren't supposed to, but he changed the time. It was only after they got Karen Reed's car that investigators started finding these taillight pieces at the scene. The night or the early morning of when they find John O'Keefe and the first responders are coming, you'll see none of them saw it. None of them saw anything laying around. And he noted that Proctor's prints were found on the evidence too. So that's a lot. That's a lot to start with in your statement. And like I said, I feel like he did a great job. So the first witness was Paul O'Keefe. He is John O'Keefe's younger brother. He got emotional when they asked him about his siblings, especially when he would mention John's name. He had a good relationship with Karen Reed. He went to the hospital and was able to see John's body, and the defense did not cross-examine him. So in my notes, I said that he was emotional when naming his siblings, especially when he mentioned John's name. He talked about John becoming the guardian of his sister's kids after she and her husband passed. Paul met Karen Reed in 2020. John O'Keefe and Karen Reed got together during the pandemic, but they had previously dated for a short time in 2004. Karen Reed worked remotely and stayed home with the kids during the pandemic because they were not in school. She would go back to her house on Mondays just to kind of, decompress, I guess you would say, have her own space for Monday. And then on Thursday, she taught a class online. Let's see. John O'Keefe didn't like Karen Reed buying expensive gifts and Dunkin' Donuts for the kids. He said that she was spoiling him. Paul witnessed a fight in Cape Cod that he said he was a referee, but said it was just typical couples fighting. They went to Aruba in December of 2021. Paul and his wife were there for his mother-in-law's birthday. John was there the same time, but on the other side of the island, and with a large group organized by a woman named Laura Sullivan. John is Laura Sullivan's son's godfather. Paul didn't see John during the trip, and they had made plans with John on January 29th, but they knew this big snowstorm was going to hit, so it didn't happen. His mom called him at 6:40 a.m. on the 29th to tell him something happened to John and he was at the hospital. It took him a while to get to the hospital because of the bad road conditions. The staff told him and his parents that John had passed. They went to see his body. He noticed that Karen Reed was there, and she was being restrained by hospital staff and was screaming, "Is he alive?" When he describes what he saw when he went in to see his brother, he says he was pretty banged up, says his eyes stood out to him the most because they looked like ping pong balls under the lids because they were so swollen. There was bleeding from his nose and his mouth, and he noticed marks on John O'Keefe's right arm. When they left the room, Karen Reed was still screaming, and Paul blew her a kiss, which, I don't know, that just seems really strange to me, but okay. Says he had a good relationship with Karen Reed, and that she thought that Karen was a good influence on the kids. They went out a few times as couples. He told the kids what happened. Karen Reed called and asked if she could come over, and he said sure. He met Karen Reed's parents on Christmas Eve and told her dad that he thought she was a great person. He recalls seeing John O'Keefe's SUV Chevy Traverse on the right side at the top of the driveway. Karen Reed arrived at John O'Keefe's house with her dad, brother, and sister-in-law. They spent about 30 minutes in the house. They told Kaylee first about John. Then Patrick came home from his sleepover. Everyone was in the kitchen. They took Patrick into a side room with Karen Reed. Karen Reed and her dad went upstairs into the bedroom for about 10 to 15 minutes. Karen Reed took some of her belongings and left with her family. Worst driving conditions he's ever seen. And then they broke for lunch. So then they showed a picture of John O'Keefe's house. He was explaining that people usually entered through the garage or the side door, not like the main front door. The side door had a Ring doorbell that was facing out. He was looking at a picture of the garage, which was more like around the corner from that door, and it had a camera with a floodlight. The Ring app access, I guess John and Karen both had access to that app. There was an objection to that. Then John would sometimes talk through the app to Paul if he wasn't home. The kids said Karen Reed had app access. And there's another objection. So looking at the picture of the driveway and the walkway leading to the side door, and then sidebar. Then we'll start looking at these videos that... Do you ever watch something and you're just like, hopefully not this video, but you're like, God, just explain this, make this make sense? It's kind of what these videos were. So we're watching video from the Ring camera over the garage. We see Karen Reed's vehicle, John's vehicle, someone else's vehicle, and Paul's vehicle. We see him and his mom. They were in the video when they came in after leaving the hospital. The Ring cam video, again, a different video, but all the same vehicles. And now Karen Reed's dad's car. Karen Reed and her dad are seen on the video. Karen Reed gets in her car just for a second. Then they go up the walkway. The Ring camera video shows Karen Reed's brother, Nathan, scraping the windshield of his dad's vehicle. Ring cam video of Patrick coming home. Ring cam video showing Karen Reed leaving with a bag. Karen Reed goes to the passenger side of her car. Her brother scrapes the windshield. Ring camera video with John O'Keefe and his car. Let's see. Paul shoveled the walkway. We get to see Paul shoveling a lot. There's a Ring cam video showing him using a snowblower that Patrick's friend's dad brought over in front of the garage. He didn't see any items in the driveway. The Ring camera, after he was done clearing the driveway, shows it was dark outside. And then they showed a picture of John in his 1971 LTD convertible. He said that John parked it in the left side of the garage, and that's the end. The defense had no questions for him. I'm not sure why they showed us this picture, but they did. Like I said, apparently he really liked this car, and he parked it on the left side of the garage, and then the right side of the garage. I guess he would park his vehicle there, but for whatever reason that night it was outside. So I can't really answer it any better than that. Okay. Then we had the victim's sister-in-law, Erin O'Keefe. She's Paul's wife, the one that just testified. She liked Karen Reed a lot. She considered her a friend. She talked to her often. She said that, I guess she had kind of like a long drive home from work, and sometimes she would just call Karen and they would just talk while she was driving home. She called Karen on the day of John's death just to kind of check on her and see how she was doing. And again, she was not cross-examined by the defense. She met Karen Reed in June of 2020 at Paul and Erin's house for a birthday or Father's Day or some occasion. She said she remembered they were having a party in the backyard on the patio. She considered her a friend. They hung out without the men, and they talked often. Karen Reed went home on Mondays and Thursdays, was at John O'Keefe's house the rest of the time. Karen Reed and John O'Keefe went through, quote, normal, everyday relationship stuff. Then she talks about the trip in for New Year's into Aruba. She says, again, they didn't see them in Aruba. Karen Reed had texted her on the flight to Aruba. And then she got a text from Karen Reed while they were there saying that she caught John O'Keefe kissing Laura's sister in the hotel lobby. Karen Reed texted her and hold on. Okay, so Karen Reed texted her and said that her and John had had an argument. She asked Erin if she wanted to meet up. Their oldest daughter, Paul and Erin's oldest daughter, apparently got COVID and stayed in Aruba with Paul. I don't know why we needed to know that, but her and the other kids came home. On January 28th, Karen Reed texted to ask if she was without Paul. She was waiting for the school bus and said they had basketball on Friday night. Paul was the coach for both teams. Aaron asked if everything was okay. Karen Reed said she wished she hadn't talked to an O'Keefe after 2004. Karen Reed and John O'Keefe argued about Karen taking Kaylee, his daughter, to Dunkies before school. Apparently, she took her and got her iced coffee, and he didn't like that. He said that she was spoiling them. Aaron noticed it was snowing and accumulating at 10:30 to 11 on the 28th. Now, that's something else I need to point out, because the prosecutor, he should look into a career as a weatherman, because he is obsessed with the weather in his testimony. Woke up to Paul being on the phone with his mom. She was concerned about Paul driving because the roads were so bad. Carrie Roberts took the O'Keefe parents to the hospital. Aaron called Karen Reed. Karen said he's dead. Carrie Roberts grabbed the phone and said no, he isn't. Aaron asked Carrie to keep her updated, but Aaron ended up calling Carrie back every 5 minutes. Around 1 o'clock, Aaron called Karen Reed to check on her. Karen answered, said she was on speaker driving with her dad to Dighton. Aaron asked what the hell happened last night. Karen Reed said they went out and she dropped him at a party. Karen Reed, Carrie, and Jen McCabe went to look for John O'Keefe. Karen Reed woke up at 4:30 a.m. to look for him. Karen said that she had to remember the bad times, which is a really weird quote, and I'm not sure what that meant exactly, but she told Aaron that she's like, I need to remember the bad times. She said, I probably won't see you guys ever again. Aaron said that they would definitely see each other again because they're friends. And after that, Aaron never talked to Karen Reed again. And that's the end of questioning for her. Like I said, she was not cross-examined. Then we get this guy. This is Officer Seraph of the Canton Police Department. He was the first to arrive on the scene on January 29th, 2022. He has dash cam footage, which we see over and over and over a lot. He was on scene for an hour to an hour and a half, and during his testimony, court was dismissed, and he'll be cross-examined the next day. So he was dispatched at 6:05 a.m. on January 29th, 2022 to 34 Fairview Road for a person unconscious outside. There was a snowstorm occurring at that time. It was dark outside. He arrived there in a couple minutes. Roads had been plowed through the night, but the roads were slippery. He took a right onto Fairview Road, going down a decent-sized hill, used his handheld spotlight on the left side of his SUV to locate the house. He has a Ford Explorer. He's got a front camera, back camera, and camera in the back seat. He saw 3 people on the lawn in the snow waving at him, 3 women. There was a male subject on the ground, which later we find out it's John O'Keefe. He did not know John O'Keefe prior to this. He asked if the male was a drug user, and they said no, he's a Boston police officer. He checked his carotid artery on his neck for a pulse, and he couldn't find one. John was cold to the touch. He was laying on his back. There was 6 inches of snow on the ground, and he said there was a light dusting of snow on John O'Keefe. And this is important just to hear the differences in people's perceptions of what they saw when they got to the scene. You know, they always say eyewitness testimony is not that reliable, and this trial is making me a big believer of that. John O'Keefe was on the left side of the property, like as you're looking at the house, he would have been to the left side. It was near blizzard conditions, very cold temps. Karen Reed was giving CPR to John. She had blood on her face. He was the first responder to arrive, then Officer Mullaney, then the fire department, an engine, and an ambulance, and then Sergeant Good. No traffic on his way to the scene. The fire department took over care of John O'Keefe. John O'Keefe had blood on his face that was wiped away. Karen Reed was visibly upset, saying, "This is all my fault. I did this. Is he dead? Is he dead?" She was hysterical and yelling. He put Karen Reed to sit in the cruiser to get her out of the elements because it was actively snowing and very cold. She kept getting out of the cruiser and walking around. He says that John O'Keefe was 20 feet off the road and the lawn. That's another fact to kind of put in the back of your head. The area around John O'Keefe's body had footprints, track marks, but there were no prints leading from the house to where John O'Keefe was. John O'Keefe, the way he was laying, his head would have been closest to the house. Let's see. He was on scene for an hour to an hour and a half. After the fire department took John O'Keefe, the 3 females left. He asked Karen Reed what happened. See what I mean? They're gone, but now we're going to go back and we're going to talk about what Karen Reed said to him. He asked Karen Reed what happened. She was upset, didn't answer him. Jen McCabe spoke to him. Carrie Roberts spoke to Sergeant Good or Mullaney. Detective Lank and Gallagher arrived around 7 a.m. The weather was still snowing and windy. Karen Reed came back to the scene after a few minutes. Another ambulance came and took Karen Reed to the hospital. And then we see a picture of the house, which I'm going to show you now. They show the front of the house, ask if that's 34 Fairview. They say yes. Then they showed a picture of a street that was snow-packed, and he said that was Fairview Road. Then we see a picture from the left side, which they always refer to these landmarks like the flagpole, the fire hydrant, and that bush. So that's kind of the area. You can see the tracks in the snow, and that's where John O'Keefe was found. He said that he was in the area in front of the flagpole and bush. He saw a vehicle, then 3 females. Let's see, the video from his car, front camera, as he arrives, it shows his whole drive there. They play the whole drive there. It took him 4 minutes. When he gets there, the 3 females are to his left. You can hear yelling after he gets out. He sees the females. Karen Reed's yelling no, puts her hands over her face. She's running back and forth from the vehicle to John. Jen McCabe is talking to him. No further questions. Now, defense is ready to cross, but court is dismissed, and there's a half day the next day. And here's just kind of a close-up of where John O'Keefe was found. All right, so we're going to move into day 2. Let me get rid of this one and go to this. All right. So the defense cross is going to be done by Alan Jackson. He's also a lawyer for Karen Reed. His cross exams are excellent. He's very charismatic. He's easy to follow, and he gets kind of spicy, snarky with some of the witnesses, and it's entertaining. I'm not going to lie. It's entertaining. So we still have Officer Seraph on the stand. He asked him about the dispatch log. Seraph says he hasn't looked at it. He shows the log for January 29th to Seraph. It said that Seraph, Mullaney, and Good arrived within 7 seconds of each other. It shows Mullaney first. Seraph says the log is wrong. It says the actual times, I guess, were Mullaney got there at 6:11, Seraph got there 6:10, Good got there at 6:16. The times in order of arrival are wrong. Seraph says otherwise the log is correct. Alan Jackson says the address is wrong. It says 32 Fairview, not 34. Seraph told the grand jury that he went to 35 Fairview, which is also incorrect. Sergeant Good's report says 32 Fairview. None of the reports list 34 Fairview as the address. Sarah says it's not intentional to hide that it was Brian Albert's address. It was just repeated mistakes by everyone. He saw Karen Reed doing mouth-to-mouth on John O'Keefe. He saw blood on Karen Reed's face. Carrie Roberts helped with chest compressions. He doesn't recall seeing that. Jen McCabe did not engage in any life-saving measures. Jennifer McCabe pulled him aside while Karen Reed and Carrie stayed with John O'Keefe. Jennifer McCabe engages him in a narrative for several minutes. She never said it was her sister's house, which is interesting. She never mentions, oh, by the way, this is my sister's house where this happened. Karen Reed was more focused than Jen McCabe in physically trying to save John O'Keefe's life. Officer Seraph says he's trained to write reports as soon as possible for detail and accuracy. His incident report was written on January 29th. He said Karen Reed kept screaming, "Is he dead? Is he dead?" She was hysterical and unable to tell him what happened. When he was interviewed by Trooper Michael Proctor, who at some point I start referring to as Trooper P, I have this crazy shorthand in these notes because everything goes so fast. He was interviewed by Trooper P the next day. In that report, Seraph said he heard Karen Reed saying, "Is he dead?" as EMTs worked on John O'Keefe. He said she was severely distraught. On April 14th, 2022, at the grand jury, he says he doesn't recall meeting or communicating with Lally before the grand jury testimony. He testified and says he didn't change his story. He testified that Karen Reed said, it's my fault. I can't believe this happened. Is he going to die? Is he dead? I said, we're doing the best we can. The first time he said Karen Reed said it wasn't her fault was at the grand jury. He had never made that statement prior. He says that was an oversight that he didn't write that down. He said, yesterday's testimony story changed again. He's really good, Alan Jackson is really good at pointing out, wait, but you just testified to blah, blah, blah. So yesterday he said, Karen Reed said, it's all my fault, I did this. What Karen Reed actually said, according to his dash cam, he asked what happened. He doesn't recall how Karen Reed answered. Alan Jackson says, Karen Reed said, my boyfriend. I left him and he never came home. Seraph says, I don't know, I don't recall. He shows him the dash cam video that was previously shown and turns the volume up so he can hear it. He tells him to listen 9 seconds after he asks what happened. Listen to what the woman says. Seraph says he couldn't understand anything. Alan Jackson replays it louder. You can hear Karen say, I left him, he didn't come home. Seraph again says he can't hear it. Alan Jackson says, do you want to hear it one more time? And the judge says no. Alan Jackson asks if Karen Reed said that, wouldn't you find that important enough to include in your report? Objection, sustained. Alan Jackson wants to show more dash cam video. Judge calls for a sidebar. Alan Jackson shows Seraph the dash cam shows his dash cam on the left-hand side of the screen and Sergeant Goods on the right-hand side of the screen. There are two different perspectives of the same scene, basically because of where they parked. There's a person wearing a hood with fur. Alan Jackson says, is that Carrie Roberts? Seraph says, I don't know. There's another person with a dark jacket in front of that person. Alan Jackson says, focus on that person with the darker jacket. The person walks towards an SUV that's parked in the driveway of 34 Fairview. Person stands by the car. There's, stands by car covered with snow in front of an SUV. She's walking towards the house. He says, now watch Goods camera, which is a view of the front of the house where the door is. He says, do you see the person going into the house? That was Jennifer McCabe going into the house, wasn't it? Sheriff says, I don't know. I have no idea. Alan Jackson says, it was a person going into the house. Sheriff says, yeah, it was a person. Alan Jackson says, did you give anyone permission to go into the house? And he says, no. Alan Jackson says, would you think a witness at a homicide scene being allowed to go into a house to make contact with other witnesses at a homicide scene? And Sheriff interrupts and says, I didn't know it was a homicide scene, sir. And then Alan Jackson says, if I could finish my question, do you think it's appropriate for a witness at a potential homicide scene, an unconscious person scene, a crime scene, to make contact with other witnesses and begin discussing the situation unsupervised? Sheriff says, can you rephrase the question? He says, do you think that's an appropriate thing to have happen? Sheriff says, I don't have an answer for that. I don't know what you're asking. He says, Officer Sheriff, when you go to a scene, one of the first things you want to do is secure the scene and separate witnesses so interviews can be conducted, correct? Sheriff says, sure. Jackson says, you wouldn't want witnesses cavorting together and getting their stories straight, correct? Sheriff says, correct. Jackson says, you'd want to avoid that at all costs. Sheriff says, yes, yes. Jackson asks, why is that? And Sheriff says, so they can't collaborate their story. Jackson says, yet there was a person walking from where a body was found on the lawn of a house, walking into the house to make contact with other individuals. Sheriff says, it appeared that way, yes, sir. Jackson asks, does that seem appropriate to you? Sheriff shrugs and says, no. Jackson says, did you hear Karen Reed repeating, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him? Sheriff says, I hit him? No, I didn't hear that part. He says if he had heard it, he would have written it down. Says he would have likely reported it to Trooper Proctor the next day. Says he would have likely mentioned it at the grand jury. And says he did not hear that statement. He looked around the scene for anything of evidentiary value, never found a single piece of plastic material, never found a single piece of taillight, didn't see 45 pieces of plastic material, never located John O'Keefe's missing shoe or missing clothes. It never crossed his mind to look inside the house for the shoe. He didn't think that would be appropriate protocol. He didn't conduct a search of the house. Alan Jackson asked, is he aware that no law enforcement has performed a search of the house to this day? And he says that he's not aware of that. That's the end of cross. We have redirect by Lally. He explains the dispatch log. The officer at the desk dispatches people to the scene, LE, fire department, whatever resources are going to be needed. And then they type in what the call is and who's going. Lally says, is it more important to get people to the scene than mark time accurately to the second? Sheriff says, absolutely. He says that what he testified to hearing is accurate as to his memory of what happened at the scene. He says he didn't know the three females or John O'Keefe prior to the call. He's not able to differentiate between Carrie Roberts and Jennifer McCabe on the dash cam video. He didn't see anyone from 34 Fairview come outside, and he didn't see anyone from any address on that street come out. And then he is dismissed. Next, we get Officer Stephen Mullaney, also of the Canton Fire Department. He was the junior officer on the scene. He arrived after Sheriff. He assisted the fire department getting John on the stretcher. He was at the scene for 90 minutes to 2 hours, and some interesting information comes out during his cross. So, Officer Stephen Mullaney of the Camden Police Department was dispatched to 34 Fairview Road just after 6 a.m., January 29th, 2022, for an unresponsive party. On the 28th, going into the 29th, it began to snow. Here we go again with the weather. By morning, it was pretty heavy snow. He was 1.5 to 2 miles away. The house was on his right when he arrived. Sheriff got there first. Visibility was difficult on the drive. It was still dark. No traffic on the way there. He used his blue lights, but no siren. Took him approximately 3 minutes to arrive. He saw Seraph and a couple other people surrounding the body. Fire department showed up at about the same time. It was the fire department engine and ambulance. When he arrived, he said that he saw people around John O'Keefe, but he had to get closer before he could see John O'Keefe. He saw Seraph standing up next to John O'Keefe before he actually saw John O'Keefe. Doesn't recall if there were any streetlights. He encountered Jen McCabe and Carrie Roberts, then remembers that Carrie Roberts was there. He was like, yeah, I encountered Jen McCabe, and then I think the prosecutor said something about Carrie Roberts, and he goes, oh yeah, I remember Carrie Roberts was there. He didn't know any of them before the call. The fire department began life-saving measures. They got him on a backboard and then a stretcher. He assisted the fire department putting John on the backboard and the stretcher. John was face up on the front lawn, approximately 10 feet from the curb. Snow covered the curb when he got there, approximately 6 inches of snow on the ground, but there was no snow on John O'Keefe, but you could tell that he had been in the conditions. It was kind of like water frozen onto his face. He made no observations the rest of his body or how he was dressed. He doesn't recall if there was any snow on any other part of John O'Keefe's body. He doesn't recall any injuries. When John O'Keefe was lifted up off the ground, he doesn't recall anything about the area beneath him. He says, quote, he was in front of me, so I wouldn't have seen what was under him. After the fire department took John O'Keefe, he and Officer Seraph were trying to identify the victim, so he talked to Jen McCabe for approximately 2 minutes. He says Karen Reed was screaming, is that my boyfriend? Is he dead? Repeated, is he dead? Many times, very loudly. The ambulance was on scene approximately 10 minutes. The ambulance went to Good Samaritan Hospital. After the ambulance left, the 3 females left the scene. He had no further contact with them. Karen Reed was screaming and very distraught. She went into one of the cruisers to stay warm, but he doesn't recall where the other 2 women were in relation to Karen Reed. After the females left the scene, they were advised by dispatch that Karen Reed was making suicidal statements. Someone called Miss Roberts to come back to the scene, and they Section 12'd Karen Reed, which basically means they had to take her to the hospital for a psych evaluation. They returned approximately 5 minutes after originally leaving. He says Sergeant Good, Lank, and Gallagher arrived after him. He was on scene for 90 minutes to 2 hours. The temp was very cold, maybe 25 degrees, windy, constant wind with gusts, and then he says it was light wind. He says he didn't observe anything in the area where John O'Keefe had been after the fire department removed him. He said Karen Reed was taken by a different ambulance to Good Samaritan. He didn't come into contact with John O'Keefe's body at any point, so he didn't make any tactile observations. He's shown the dash cam video still again and says, was that accurate as far as what the weather was? And he says yes, of course, because they're all going to say yes because it's the same. Let's see. He shows him the picture of the house with the flagpole. He says John O'Keefe was at the left of the residence where the fire hydrant and flagpole are. Uses a laser pointer to show in a picture where John O'Keefe was found. And then we have cross-examination again by Alan Jackson. Let's see. He said he started as a part-time officer, was only full-time approximately 6 months at the time of the call. He was the junior officer on the scene. He saw a woman giving CPR at the time, but didn't know who, but later learned who it was, but doesn't recall who. I'm telling you guys, some of this testimony, I'm like, oh my God. And like, my husband could care less, and he gets inundated with this every night. Okay, let's see. Karen Reed. He didn't notice blood on Karen Reed's face, even though he was approximately 10 feet away from her. He didn't see any blood in her hair. He didn't notice that, he did notice that she was hysterical and completely distraught, says she was in shock. Jen McCabe was not hysterical or distraught. He had contact with Jen McCabe, spoke to her face to face for 2 minutes. He was closer to Jen McCabe than he ever got to Karen Reed. Jen McCabe was calm, no blood on her face or in her hair. He heard Karen Reed say, "Is he dead? That's my boyfriend." Repeated it more than 10 times. She was screaming very loudly. He says he never heard Karen Reed say, "I did it." He never heard Karen Reed say, "It's my fault." Never heard Karen Reed say, "I hit him, I hit him, I hit him." He was standing by in the area where John O'Keefe's body had been, but didn't participate in the search for evidence. Let's see. He was standing about 10 to 12 feet from where John O'Keefe had been. Doesn't recall anyone putting up crime scene tape. He saw other officers searching the area. He saw officers use a leaf blower to clear some of the snow from the area. He doesn't know where the leaf blower came from, but he believes that Lieutenant Gallagher had it. Gallagher got there approximately 45 minutes after him. Lieutenant Gallagher used a handheld leaf blower on the front lawn around where John O'Keefe had been. Sergeant Lank and Sergeant Good were in the area at the time. They are superior officers to him. He did not see 45 pieces of bright red, black, and clear plastic scattered either before or after the leaf blower was used. He didn't see even one piece of broken plastic. He didn't see any blankets on scene. He didn't know one of the females had a sister who lived in the house. He didn't see Jen McCabe approach the house at any time while he was on scene. He wasn't alerted by anyone that Jen McCabe entered the house while he was on scene. He didn't see Jen McCabe come out of the house with blankets or anything that would comfort John O'Keefe. He wasn't aware that there were any first responders in the house. No one told him. He never saw Karen Reed and Jen McCabe in a vehicle together. He never heard Karen Reed ask Jen McCabe to Google anything. That's important. Remember that nugget. Nothing further. So we have redirect by Lally. He asks if he's been on other scenes where friends and family are with someone injured. And he says, people don't react the same. Not everyone screams and yells different things. Carrie Roberts didn't have blood on her face or in her hair, and she wasn't screaming. He didn't see anyone go in or come out of 34 Fairview Road. He didn't see any neighbors come out either. Nothing further from him. And then this is priceless. We have Recross by Alan Jackson, and he says, but did any of the other neighbors have a body of a dead police officer on their front lawn? Immediate objection sustained. Judge dismisses the witness, doesn't even give Alan Jackson a chance to ask another question. Then we get Timothy Nuttall. This guy. I wanted to like this guy. He seemed like knowledgeable when he was first talking, but it just went to hell in a handbasket when Alan Jackson gets a hold of him. Wow. So Timothy Nuttall is a firefighter paramedic with Canton Fire Department, and he is the field training officer for his group. He went in early for shift because of the snowstorm coming. He was on the ambulance that transported John. He's adamant about a puffy coat. Adamant. Under Cross, we learn about inconsistencies and that his story has changed. So he's been a firefighter paramedic with the Canton Fire Department for almost 6 years. He got his EMT license in high school, worked as a paramedic for 7 years, and became a fireman. Gives a rundown of his education, what kind of classes and training he's had. He's been a field training officer for his group in Canton. And I wrote down, seems very knowledgeable. I was wrong. And this, you're going to hear this repeated, literally every witness for a while. He worked 8 a.m. the 29th to 8 a.m. on the 30th. He knew a significant storm was coming, so he left earlier than normal to go to work. He actually got there at about 5:45 a.m. He said the roads were starting to be treated, that snow accumulations were beginning to happen. It was approaching blizzard conditions. It was windy and snowy. They got a dispatch for an unresponsive male in a snowbank outside 34 Fairview Road. He went on the ambulance to provide an extra set of hands since he was there early. He started prepping the gear that they would need to use at the scene. When they arrived, it was dark. There were stronger winds, increased snow. He heard a commotion or screaming, saw 3 people huddled around a human form in the snow, 3 females. He went straight to John O'Keefe. John O'Keefe was laying supine in snow, no signs of life, no pulse or breathing, and began high-quality CPR. He was at the head with an O2 bag valve mask, the one that, they put the mask over your face and then it has the big, looks like a balloon that they squeeze. John O'Keefe was left of center of the house. There was a small pool of blood that appeared to be beneath him. He's the first person that's mentioned that. He says John was about 6 to 8 feet from the curb. John O'Keefe, now this is really where it gets crazy. He says John O'Keefe was dressed for the weather. He had several layers on. Other firefighters got extraction equipment, a scoop stretcher, and an ambulance stretcher. The group of three women were agitated, and it was a scene of heightened emotions. In the ambulance, the lighting was better. Duh. They saw more injuries after getting him out of his winter clothing. They continued CPR and eventually switched to mechanical CPR, which is a machine. It kind of looks like a plunger, and it does the compressions for you. All of his clothing was removed for access to any injuries. He was told later that John O'Keefe was missing a shoe, but he didn't really notice. The clothing is brought in and deposited on the floor of the room the patient is being treated in at the hospital. He doesn't know where the clothing went after being taken into the hospital, which actually I've heard, I think it was Trooper Proctor drove around with it in the floorboards of his car for like a week or 2. So that's great evidence handling. Let's see. Didn't know where the clothing went after being taken into the hospital. In the ambulance after the clothing was removed, John O'Keefe was noted to have a hematoma on the right side of his face, above his eye, on his forehead. Scratches on his right arm, the upper arm, pretty good egg on his head, is how he described it. He said he had blood, mucus, and bile at the back of his airway, and it had to be suctioned out prior to putting in an advanced airway or endotracheal tube. He doesn't think he saw any injuries to the left arm, but the scratches on the right arm ran approximately 3 to 4 inches below his shoulder to 2 inches above the elbow. John O'Keefe's nose was cold. He was cold to the touch all the way around. He said his nose was quite white because he had been in the elements for a while. There appeared to be a little bit of blood on his nose. Why are my pages stuck? Sorry. The injuries on his arm were not actively bleeding. All of his digits on his upper extremities were very cold, immobile, and very stiff. Now, this is key, you guys. I told you this guy's adamant, right? It caused problems with trying to get his clothing off because they were so stiff. Remember that. Outside of the ambulance at the scene, he asked if anyone had seen what happened. One individual said, I hit him. She was mid-40s, average build, average height. The other 2 were very similar. I hit him was repeated over and over at varying volumes. Everyone appeared to be quite flustered. The one who said, I hit him, appeared to have blood on her face, presumably from attempting CPR. No one was touching John O'Keefe when he arrived. The whole group was pacing, running around in circles. In the back of the ambulance, it was him, EMT Matt Kelly. Matt Kelly assisted with ventilation. Paramedic Anthony Flamati was running everything else. Cardiac monitor, medications were being administered. Flamati asked firefighter McLaughlin to ask for information like name, date of birth, significant medical conditions, history, etc. Flamati would have had responsibility of compiling a patient care report. He's shown that report. Then he looks at the picture of the house. Yeah, that's the house. Looks at the picture of the house from the flagpole angle. Yep, that's the house. Uses a laser pointer to where John O'Keefe was found. He looks at a picture of where John O'Keefe was, that one I showed you, the snow, and he points to where the blood is. Then we have cross-examination by Alan Jackson again. He says they typically cut and fold over clothing on the patient in the ambulance. Big puffy jackets are not cut and removed because the filling in the jacket, it gets everywhere and it's like a mess and it's in their way, yada yada. Testimony about the big heavy coat are consistent with his grand jury testimony. He's shown a photo and asked if that's what John O'Keefe was wearing. He doesn't recognize it. And in that picture, I'm going to show you later, it shows a thin, lighter hoodie, not a heavy winter coat. He said he was focused on the patient, not how many law enforcement were there, nothing specific about the 3 females except one had blood on her face. Says that he may not know exactly what John O'Keefe was wearing. His grand jury testimony was about the egg on his head, not the trauma to the back of his head. His injury on his arms or scratches are like furrows in the skin. And this was a comical moment because he's got a super thick Boston accent and he's like, furrows. And he's like, what? Alan Jackson's like, what? And he says it again. And he's like, I don't understand that word. And he's like, furrow. And then Alan Jackson finally figures it out. But when he says it, he claws at his arm like this. And Alan Jackson asked him to repeat that action for the jury, and there's an objection, and the judge won't allow him to do it. He doesn't recall a laceration under John O'Keefe's eyebrow or nose. Blood seen on the nose could have been from a small laceration. In addition to the egg on the right side of his head, he had a black eye on the left side. Both eyes were blackened, but primarily on the right side. Jackson asked if injuries look consistent with being in an altercation. There's an objection, sustained. He says, did it look like he had been in a fight? Objection, sustained. Judge calls sidebar. And then this exchange. Alan Jackson says, in your experience as a field training officer, have you witnessed injuries that are a product of a fist fight? Yes. Injuries to the face? Yes. Injuries to the mouth, nose, ears? Yes. To the eyes? Defensive wounds on the hands? Yes. Did you note that John O'Keefe's injuries were consistent or inconsistent with a physical altercation? Nuttall says, I couldn't say. Jackson says, consistent with being in a fight? Again, I couldn't say. The egg over his right eye, consistent or inconsistent with him being punched or hit? I couldn't say. Alan Jackson says, you said one of the common ways to get that egg or hematoma is being punched. Nuttall says, there's quite a few reasons a person could get an egg such as that. You could get hit with a golf ball, for instance. Alan Jackson says, I'm not asking you to the exclusion of everything else. I'm asking, is it consistent? Nuttall finally says, it's consistent. It could be. And the other injuries as well, and Nuttall says, correct. Bruising on the back of his hands could have been there, but just not visible due to the conditions. His hands were very white and very cold. Jackson says, while you were knelt down at John O'Keefe's head, you asked, do you know him? And she answered, I hit him, I hit him. He says, yes. Jackson says, but that's not what you told Trooper Proctor in an interview on February 8th. Nuttall says, I do not recall what I told Trooper Proctor. Alan Jackson says, do you recall on February 8th telling Trooper Proctor that while you were rendering aid, you heard Karen Reed say, I hit him to another female at the scene? Nuttall says, as I stated, I heard I hit him several times. As to who that was directed to, I don't know. Again, I was focused on patient care. Jackson says, my question is a little different. I ask if you recall telling Trooper Proctor that while you were rendering aid, you heard Karen say, "I hit him," to another female on the scene, and the other female told Karen to be quiet. And then he's like, "Oh yeah, I do recall that." Jackson says, "That's not what you testified to today, though." And Nuttall says, "Okay." Jackson says, "As a matter of fact, that story has changed to you posed a question and she answered your question, right?" Nuttall says, "Correct." Jackson says, "So which is it?" Nuttall says, "I wouldn't say the story has changed. I don't fully recall the meeting with Mr. Proctor. I remember meeting with him. However, I don't fully remember what was discussed. He didn't tell the hospital that he heard a woman say she hit John O'Keefe, and that's how he received his injuries. He didn't write a report that said, 'While I was at the scene, I heard a female say I hit him, and that's the cause and manner of his injuries.' He never contacted the Canton Police Department or Massachusetts State Police Department to tell them. The first time he said that was to Trooper Proctor on February 8th. Now today he's saying he didn't overhear her say it to another female. Now he's saying she said it directly to him." Alan Jackson says, "How many times have you discussed this case, this incident, with your fellow firefighters?" Nuttall says, "It's brought up around the station semi-frequently, but being involved in it, we try to stay clear of it because we are involved in it." So Jackson says, "So the answer is daily?" Nuttall says, "Frequently." Jackson says, "Have any of those discussions helped you to describe as... Have any of those discussions helped you with what you describe as a faulty memory at that time?" Nuttall says, "I don't believe my story has been swayed." Redirect. Injuries could have been through a lot of different causes, and then Nuttall is dismissed. Then we get Anthony Flamati. He is also a firefighter, paramedic with the Canton Fire Department. He was on the ambulance that transported John O'Keefe. He was the lead tech on the call. He was responsible for writing the EMS report. The judge stops his testimony and dismisses court. It was only a half day. So he currently is the acting lieutenant for the Canton Fire Department. They go through his past experience as an EMT and a fireman, his education, certifications, yada yada. He worked 8 a.m. on the 28th to 8 a.m. on the 29th, just like everybody else. Matthew Kelly was on the ambulance. He had just started a few months earlier and had very limited medical experience. Matthew Kelly. Flamati knew the storm was coming in, so he went in at 6 p.m. the night before and picked up overtime. They predicted heavy snow and wind. It started snowing after 10 p.m. He got up around 5 a.m. to shovel snow. He got the call at around 6, and there was 4 to 6 inches of snow. There was a man on the side of the road. The visibility was poor. 20 to 30 mile an hour wind. Temps in the 20s. He, Matthew Kelly, and Nuttall went in the ambulance. Kelly drove. Nuttall was in the back. He was in the passenger seat. It was slow driving. It was dark, heavy snow, and wind. Visibility was almost zero. The car 5, which the captain drives, and engine 3 had 3 firefighters on it, and they also responded. It was approximately 5 to 6 minutes to arrive at the scene. He wrote the EMS report. A third party documents timestamps during the call. He shows him his report. It says dispatch 606, en route 607, arrived 614, at patient 615, transport 627, arrived at hospital at 645. They drove downhill towards the scene on the left side. He saw 2 females going back and forth between the body and the side of the street. There was a female pressing on the chest of the victim. Doesn't recall if there were any street lights. The body was ID'd after they were in the ambulance. He brought the equipment over to start working on the patient, and that's where the testimony is cut off for the day. Now on day 3, John O'Keefe's dad was not there, and bless this man, he's older, and he looks not well. I mean, the stress of all of this is obviously gotten to him. And I was worried when he wasn't there, but it was his mom was still there, and his brother and his sister-in-law were there. Okay, so direct continues with Lally. The judge reviews what evidence is. She says the videos are evidence, audio is evidence. Then Flamati says that on arrival, he was in the passenger seat. There were two females going back and forth between the victim and the side of the road. He could see a body shape on the ground. The body was to his left. John O'Keefe's wallet was in his pocket, and they used his license to identify him. He was on his back. He assessed him for cardiac arrest. Due to the extreme cold, a body can be preserved and viability is improved. Said he was a middle-aged male. His limbs and jaw were able to be moved. There was no lividity on the back of the body. It was red with no blood pooling. He was deemed viable for resuscitation. He initiated CPR. First responders and two females were near John O'Keefe when they arrived. He had snow up to his ribs, he says. 4 to 6 inches of snow on the ground. The top of his body was clear. He says he was underdressed for the weather, where Nuttall said he was dressed appropriately for the weather. He says he was wearing a long sleeve shirt and jeans. Found out he was missing a shoe after arriving at the hospital. If they had removed the shoes, they would have removed both. The females moved off to the right so they could work. He asked one of the female, and then he points and identifies Karen Reed, what was going on, what happened, etc. Karen Reed seemed most personally affected, so he figured she must have the most info. She was the most distressed and upset. Karen Reed was attempting CPR, but her erratic behavior had her running between John O'Keefe and the other female, running back and forth, pressing on John's chest, trying to wake him up and talk to him, to no avail. He asked Karen Reed if she knew who it was, how did they get here, and tried to get any information from her with no luck. The only response he got from Karen Reed was, I hit him, oh my God, I hit him. She was within 2 feet of him and very loud. He asked, did you hit him with your hand? Did you kick him? What happened? Karen Reed just repeated the phrase over and over, I hit him, I hit him. This conversation was on approach to the patient. CPR was initiated. They determined it was a viable arrest. They gave him oxygen with the bag valve mask. They used an easy IO, which is a drill that they use. They put a needle into the tibia of the patient with this drill into his right tibia. They gave him warming fluids to bring up his core temperature. They gave him epinephrine every 3 to 5 minutes. Let's see. The epinephrine was used to improve quality of the cardiac muscle and cerebral muscle during the resuscitation. The epinephrine was started inside the ambulance. He used what he called an OPA to push the tongue out of the way. They stripped the patient. They turned up the heat in the ambulance. They switched to mechanical CPR with something called a Lucas device. Patient was warming up. They intubated him. They suctioned his airway 2 times. The second time was deep suction through the endotracheal tube. The complications he listed were vomiting, aspiration, and another IO was drilled into his left tibia. They arrived at the hospital at 6:45. When he was found, he was in asystole or flatline. Flamati was the team lead. John's clothing was wet and cold. His clothing was intact. Outside of the ambulance, the injuries observed were, he says bleeding was not obvious. Inside the ambulance, he noticed hemorrhage from the mouth, eyes, and nose. Blood and sputum, suction from airway. The first time they got 150 milliliters. The second time when they did the deep suction, they got 50 milliliters. There was redness on the back of the body. He had the beginning of frostbite from exposure to the cold. He had cold, white, pasty ears, nose, and fingers, which equals frostbite. His injuries He had swollen eyes, a contusion on his forehead, markings on extremities. His abdomen was distended or swollen. Could be due to trauma, but maybe bloating. He had cold, rigid fingers, hands, feet, multiple dried blood lacerations to the right arm, his upper arm. He assumed the dried blood injuries happened hours before the incident that led him to be there. Earlier in the evening, firefighter asked Katie McLaughlin to get info from Karen Reed about why he was there, how long he had been down, etc. Both John O'Keefe's eyes were swollen and bleeding. His pupils were 4 millimeters and non-reactive. During transport from 6:27 to 6:45, there were no changes in his status. He was still flatline. It was a slow transport due to the weather. They called the hospital when they were 5 to 10 minutes out so that they could prepare at the hospital. His core body temperature was 80 degrees, which equals extreme hypothermia. He stayed at the hospital for 10 to 15 minutes after the transfer of care. And to answer any questions, he doesn't recall if they returned to the hospital during his shift for any other medical calls. They show him the picture of the front of the house. They show the picture of where John O'Keefe was found, the blood on the snow and the footprints. They show him the picture of the house with the flagpole. He uses the laser pointer to show area where John O'Keefe was found and nothing further. We have cross-examination by Alan Jackson again. He says he could see the body when he arrived. He was on the left side of the ambulance while seated. He could see the body when he arrived on the left side of the ambulance while seated in the right front passenger seat. There were mounds of snow in the area, but not over the body. There were snow drifts from the wind. He doesn't recall seeing actively bleeding lacerations over John O'Keefe's right eye, only bruising and swelling. He believes John O'Keefe was bleeding from his nostrils, not from any lacerations on his nose. He doesn't know if there were any lacerations on John's nose. He didn't notice any contusions on his abdomen, no abraded or cut skin on the abdomen. The abdomen was distended with no visible trauma. His conversation with Karen Reed. At the grand jury, he testified that as lead on the call, he was trying to get as much information as he could. Ask questions like, do you know him? How did he get here? What happened? Is there any additional information you can give me about what happened? He had enough of a conversation with Karen Reed for her to say, I hit him. Oh my God, I hit him. He tried to follow up with additional elaborating questions. He was having a conversation face to face, looking her in the eye, standing still. The conversation was frustrating because he was getting no information. So he turned the conversation over to firefighter Katie McLaughlin. There's an objection, sustained. They're told to ask it in a different way. Conversation wasn't productive, so turned the conversation over to firefighter McLaughlin. The treatment of the patient was his priority regardless of how he ended up there. He was doing chest compressions initially until he could turn that over to someone else. Alan Jackson demonstrates what chest compressions would look like, like what it would look like if a person was giving someone chest compressions. Flamati agrees. Flamati was wearing his uniform, heavy winter coat, but he doesn't remember if he or Katie McLaughlin were wearing their bright yellow coats. The conversation with Karen Reed lasted about a minute. As he was doing high-quality CPR, John O'Keefe was moved onto the scoop gurney, then moved into the ambulance. His first priority was CPR. Second was warming him up. He never came back out of the ambulance. Once they got in, they closed the doors of the ambulance. In the ambulance was Nuttall and Kelly. McLaughlin was outside the ambulance initially, then she assisted with interventions in the back. After they established everything and they were ready to transport, McLaughlin drove the ambulance. He shows Seraph's dash cam on top of goods on the bottom. Asks Flamati to show where the conversation with Karen Reed took place, and the judge calls a sidebar. Alan Jackson says, focus on the top dash cam video. Judge calls another sidebar, then calls for a 15-minute recess. Jackson again says, focus on the top video, and that he may pause to ask questions. Jackson says, do you see someone run into frame? Who is that? Flamati says, I don't recall. He says, look at the left side of the video. Do you see someone in a bright yellow jacket? Flamati says, yes. Do you recognize that person? He says, I see a yellow jacket, but I can't tell you who it is. Jackson says, based on your memory, by the way, have you seen this before? Flamati says, no. Based on your memory, is that the approximate position that John O'Keefe was in when you made contact? Flamati says, approximately. I'd say a little more to the left. Jackson says, do you see the person enter the frame from screen left? Flamati says, it looks like a different person. Jackson says, that person appears to be a female with long hair. Flamati says, yes. Does that appear to be my client? I couldn't tell you. See that person wearing yellow on the left side of the screen? Flamati says, if you're telling me that's a person, yes. And the judge interrupts and says, no, he's not telling you. So ask the question. If you don't see it, you don't see it. If you do, you do. Flamati says, I can't tell what that shape is. Jackson says, keep your eyes focused on that area and tell me if you see that figure doing anything. Do you recognize that figure now? Flamati says, I can't recognize the figure, but it looks like an up and down rhythmic motion that would indicate CPR. Jackson says, would that be you? Flamati says, I couldn't tell you. Is the time accurate? 6:13? Jackson says, I'm just asking you what you recognize in the video. Flamati says, I couldn't tell you if that was myself or not. Jackson says, was there someone else doing CPR? Flamati says, multiple people rotate through CPR, so yeah. Jackson says, who is responsible for doing chest compressions? Flamati says, whoever is closest to that area. We're all trained. We're all trained for that skill. Sorry, got my pages mixed up here. I'm asking in this particular case, Flamati says, yeah. Jackson says, didn't you testify earlier that you were the one doing chest compressions? Flamati said, I said I was one of them. Jackson says, does that appear to be you doing chest compressions? Flamati says, it could be, I'm not sure. Jackson says, do you see the person in the middle of the screen? Flamati says, yes. Jackson says, does that appear to be my client? Flamati says, I can't tell. Jackson says, you sure you see individuals entering from screen right? Flamati says, yes. Who does that appear to be in the yellow jacket? Flamati says, that build, it could have been Kelly or firefighter McLaughlin. And there's a stretcher shown in the video, by the way. I made a note of that, so it's important, I guess. Jackson says, who's the person trailing? Flamati says, I can't tell. Jackson says, the person in the hood just obscured that figure. Did you see that person on the other side? Flamati says, no. Jackson says, the activity going on just to the left side of the SUV in the frame. Can you describe for the jurors what that activity is? Flamati says, they'd be lowering the stretcher to get the patient on. Jackson says, now, this person appears to be facing the camera. Do you recognize this person? Flamati says, I don't. Jackson says, can you focus your attention on that individual in the bright yellow jacket? What does that person appear to be doing? Flamati says, CPR. Jackson says, which part of the CPR? Flamati says, chest compressions. Jackson says, is that you? Flamati says, I don't know. Jackson says, you don't remember at this point if that was you that was doing chest compressions as they moved him from the ground to the gurney? Flamati says, I don't recall. Jackson says, but you did testify earlier that you were doing chest compressions. Flamati says, I did at some point during this call, yes. Jackson says, at any time during this video, did you see anyone trade off with that person who was doing chest compressions from the time he was on the ground to the time the patient was on the gurney? Flamati says, it could be the same person, I'm not sure. Jackson says, would you say that's probably you? And there's an objection. Sustained. Jury is told to disregard that. Jackson says, I want to direct your attention to this person in the middle wearing a yellow jacket. That appears to be a firefighter. Flamati says, yes. There's an objection. Sustained. She has to see counsel at sidebar. Jackson says, take a look at the yellow in the middle of the screen. Do you recognize that? Flamati says it's a firefighter jacket and billed, I guess it's either firefighter Kelly or, and then the judge says, so we don't want you to guess. Flamati says, my best estimation is firefighter McLaughlin. Jackson says, firefighter McLaughlin? Okay. Do you recognize the person in yellow? The person to the right of you who you ID'd as firefighter McLaughlin? Flamati says, no. Jackson says, what do they appear to be carrying? Flamati says, I would guess, oh, I'm sorry. And the judge says, not even an estimate. Do you know? And Flamati says, no. Judge says, next question. Jackson says, at that point, did you join your colleagues in putting John in the ambulance? Flamati says, yes. Jackson says, okay, based on that, could that be you in the yellow jacket following the gurney? Yes. Who is the firefighter at the front side of the gurney? I don't know. Okay, but one of your colleagues, though? Yes. What did you do once you left the frame? Where did you go? Flamati says that would have been into the ambulance. Jackson says, and as you earlier indicated, you shut the doors. Correct. And you never came back out. No. I'd like to draw your attention to the lower video and see if you recognize anything. I'm going to ask you to look up to the right. Do you see that person in yellow? Flamati says, yes. Any idea who that is? No. Do you see a vehicle in the middle of the screen? Yes, it's an ambulance. Does that appear to be the ambulance you arrived in? Yes. And the ambulance you took John O'Keefe to the hospital? Yes. Doors are closed? Yes. Are you in the ambulance at this point? Flamati says, I'm not sure. Jackson says, well, this is running continuously with no pauses. You've already taken John O'Keefe to the ambulance. Would you have gotten into the ambulance? Flamati says, I don't recall. Jackson says, well, I mean, you're not standing outside of the ambulance. Judge says, so if you know the answer. And Flamati says, I don't know. Judge says, next question. Jackson says, you have no idea if you were inside the ambulance at this point. Flamati says, at this point, no. There's Steve. Jackson says, would you have gone anyplace else when you left the frame? Flamati says, could have been to gather equipment, but for certain, I don't know. Jackson says, where would John O'Keefe have been? Flamati says, in the ambulance. Again, I don't know for certain. Jackson says, could have been or was in the ambulance. Flamati says, at this time, I don't know. Jackson says, you see the group of people, including the person in the yellow jacket? Flamati says, yes. Jackson says, who was the person who was directed to get the medical history from my client? Flamati says, McLaughlin. Jackson says, do you believe that's Miss McLaughlin? Flamati says, no. Jackson says, you don't think that's her? Flamati says, I'd have to rewind to know where she went. Jackson says, well, let me ask you a couple other questions. In the bottom screen, do you see this police officer? Flamati says, yes. Jackson says, see the woman with long hair standing next to the police officer. Does that appear to be my client? Flamati says, yes. The individual with the fire jacket on the right, Miss McLaughlin, was directed to get medical history and interview my client, correct? Flamati says, correct, yes. Jackson says, does that appear to be what she is doing right there? Objection sustained. At this point, where do you believe you were now? Flamati says, I don't remember. Jackson says, think you might have been in the ambulance? Flamati says, I don't remember. Jackson says, you testified earlier that when you left the screen with that gurney, you got in the ambulance, correct? Flamati says, we headed that way, yes. Jackson says, firefighter Flamati, it's not a trick question. Where did you go when you left the screen? Flamati says, it would have been either to gather equipment or to put the patient in the ambulance. Jackson says, okay, what equipment did you need to gather? Flamati said it would have been anything left by the patient's side, whether it was a first-in bag or an airway bag, any other equipment, basically. Jackson says, you were doing chest compressions. Flamati said, I didn't state that. Jackson says, you didn't say that? Flamati says, I said I did chest compressions at some point. I didn't say I did them continuously throughout the call. Jackson says, so you just put John O'Keefe in the back of the ambulance and went to look for some equipment? Flamati says, that's not what I said. So chest compressions were done continuously throughout. Whether they were done by me or another provider, I can't tell you specifically. Jackson says, so when you leave the screen and John O'Keefe is on the gurney, you're engaged in vital, life-saving endeavors, right? Yes. Jackson says, that had to have been your focus, correct? Flamati says, it was at the time, yes. Jackson says, and you wanted to get him out of the cold, the weather, correct? Yes. Because it was inclement. It was freezing out. Yes. So you wanted to put him in the ambulance, right? And you wanted to continue CPR because, in your words, you believe there might be some viability left. Flamati says, yes. Jackson says CPR and life-saving measures were absolutely vital at that point. Flamati says, yes. Jackson says, you didn't go find equipment. You got in the ambulance, didn't you? And Flamati says, yes. Jackson says, so at this point, you're in the ambulance, correct? Flamati says, at this point, I don't know. Alan Jackson says, you indicated that you never got back out of the ambulance after you got in, correct? Flamati says, I don't believe so, no. Jackson says, did you see any place in that video where you had a detailed conversation with my client? He says, no. Jackson says, did you see any place in that video where you engaged my client and said, how'd he get here? What happened? And she said, I hit him. And you said, how'd you hit him? All the stuff that you testified earlier. Flamati says, I didn't see that in the video. No. Jackson says, you indicated in a police report during an interview that you had with Gary Butnick on February 8th that my client said, I hit him, correct? Flamati says, correct. Jackson says, you remember having that conversation with Sergeant Butnick. Flamati says, I don't recall the conversation, but I'm trusting that your records are accurate. Jackson says, is it true that during the conversation you indicated to Sergeant Butnick that, quote, Katie spoke with Karen Reed? Katie is Katie who? Flamati says, McLaughlin. Jackson says, Katie spoke to Karen Reed collecting medical history for the victim and was also told by Karen Reed that the last time she saw the victim was 1 a.m. that morning. That is when Anthony, who is Anthony? And he goes, that would have been myself. Jackson says, that is when Anthony heard Karen Reed say, I hit him. Is that what you told Sergeant Butnick? Flamati again says, I don't recall. Jackson says, does it appear that this is the time, firefighter Flamati, that Kate McLaughlin is getting a medical history from my client or attempting to? Flamati says, I can't tell from the video. No. Jackson says, you do know, however, that at this time you were in an ambulance 30 to 40 feet away with the doors closed. Flamati says, I don't know. Jackson says, well, you certainly don't see yourself in that frame, do you? Flamati says, it doesn't appear to be, no. Jackson says, you were the lead firefighter on that team that night, correct? Flamati says, I was lead paramedic. Jackson says, you understood the gravity of hearing a statement like, I hit him, some sort of an explanation to what might have happened to the victim, correct? Flamati says, correct. Jackson says that statement could have a direct relational impact on how life-saving measures are done by the medical personnel you turned him over to. Flamati says, correct. Jackson says you testified at the grand jury that you wanted, once you got to the hospital, you wanted to be as helpful as possible when you handed over the patient, correct? Correct. You said you actually stayed at Good Samaritan an additional 10 to 20 minutes, which is your habit in cases like this, because you wanted to be an asset to the medical intervention team, correct? Correct. That team includes doctors and nurses that were trying to provide life-saving services to John O'Keefe, correct? Correct. But you never relayed to a single doctor or a single nurse a single word about a woman who said, I hit him, did you? Flamati says documentation ends for us at transfer of patient care. As far as my memory, I do remember relaying that info to the doctors and nurses. Jackson says, you do? Flamati says, yes. Jackson says, have you ever testified about that ever previous to this? No, never. I've never been asked about that. Jackson says, oh, no one ever asked you, so you didn't tell anybody. Flamati says, in the court setting? No. Jackson says, you testified in front of a grand jury, didn't you? Flamati says, yes. Jackson says, Mr. Lally asked you a bunch of questions. During the course of that conversation, you never disclosed under oath that you told doctors and nurses that you heard a woman say, I hit him. Flamati says, I recall telling the doctors and nurses that there was a question of that the patient was hit by a vehicle, or we don't know, is what I directly said to the doctors and nurses. Alan Jackson says, you directly told the doctors and nurses that there was a question about whether or not he had been hit by a vehicle, right? Flamati says, yes. Jackson says, had you ever said that in any context, either to the police or in a grand jury before today? Flamati says, I don't recall. Jackson says, you were asked a bunch of questions the day before yesterday and this morning by Mr. Lally. Yes. Did you say it on your direct examination? I wasn't asked that question. So since Mr. Lally didn't ask you, you just left it out that you told the doctors, the medical professionals, that in fact, you described that this patient was likely hit by a car. Objection sustained. You wrote a report as well. Yes. There's an area in the report for a narrative about your observations, experiences with the patient. Flamati says, correct. Your job as lead paramedic is to be as detailed as possible. Flamati says, correct. He shows him the report, and he says he can't point to where it indicates Karen Reed said, I hit him, or where he told that to the doctors and nurses, or that his concern for the patient was he might have been hit by a car. Flamati says, it would have been important to pass that information on. Jackson says, but it's not in your report. You didn't tell police when interviewed 9 days later. Flamati says, I wasn't asked. You didn't tell the grand jury. You didn't mention it on direct in front of these jurors. Nothing further. Redirect from Lally. The abdomen could have been distended from an internal injury. Protocol for chest compressions. One person for 2 minutes or based on exhaustion of the provider. The most important thing is quality CPR regardless of fatigue. One person shouldn't do it for 15 to 20 minutes. The conversation where Flamati heard Karen Reed say, I hit him, and the conversation between Karen Reed and firefighter McLaughlin, where Karen Reed said, I hit him, were two separate conversations. Flamati told police and the grand jury that Karen Reed told him she hit John O'Keefe. Flamati says that due to the proximity of the patient to the roadway and the vagueness of the statement, the red flag of John O'Keefe being underdressed, people don't just lie down in the snow in a blizzard. So how he got there, they aren't sure. But due to the proximity to the road, being hit by a car was his first inclination. Nothing further. Judge tries to dismiss him, but Alan Jackson says, May I, Your Honor? And she says a couple questions. Jackson says, the video is about 3 minutes. Would you say it appeared to be the same person giving chest compressions the whole way through? Flamati says, I don't know. I can't tell you. We all have yellow coats. I don't know. Somebody swapped. Jackson says, did it appear to you that the same person who started chest compressions on the left side of the screen continued the whole way through, up to the scoop, up to the gurney, up through? They were off the screen. Objection. Sustained. Jackson says, you indicated your response to hearing I hit him was, did you hit him with your hand? Did you kick him? Did you punch him? Yes. Nowhere in that conversation did you suggest, did you hit him with your car? Flamati says, I don't recall if I asked her specifically about that. Jackson says, so now you don't recall about that either. Objection. Sustained. Jackson says, and for the first time in any forum, you're telling this jury that you then thought, based on that conversation, you believed John O'Keefe had been hit by a car and that she said she did it. Flamati says, I did not say that. So I left it open-ended to the staff of the hospital that these are both possibilities of what happened to the patient. Jackson says, if you said that to the staff at the hospital, surely it would have been put in some of the medical reports. Flamati says, they don't have to, it's just really up to them. And then he is dismissed. All right. Let's see. Seem to be missing a slide. Let me see if it's on my next one. I'm sorry. Here we go. All right. So we have Matthew Kelly. Let me get a drink real quick. He is another firefighter paramedic with the Canton Fire Department. He drove the ambulance to the scene. He helped with ventilation and suction on the way to the hospital. He went into the treatment room with John at the hospital. He's been consistent in his memory of the event. He's never changed his story. Unfortunately, he doesn't recall a lot during cross. All right, so Lally goes over his experience, training, education, certification. He worked a 24-hour shift, January 28th to January 29th, 8 a.m. to 8 a.m., just like everybody else. Woke up at 4:45 a.m., shoveled snow, prepared for the shift. There was snow on the ground. It was still snowing. There were high winds. It was dark. There was poor visibility. Got called just after 6 for an unresponsive male in the snow on Fairview Road. He drove. Flamati was in the passenger seat, and Nuttall was in the back. And I made a note because if you watch the Johnny Depp trial, Elaine Bradyhoff, Amber Heard's attorney, loved to use the phrase, what if anything? And Lally does too. Almost every question, what if anything? And it gets really old. Okay, then they talked about who was on the fire engine. They drove slow because of weather. There was quite a bit of snow on the ground. It was a steep downhill road. He didn't see any traffic on the way. He stopped in front of the police cruiser. He couldn't see the body until he got out of the ambulance. He was about 5 feet away when he saw the victim. It was dark. He picked up the bags that they'd need, the first in bag, the airway bag, and the cardiac monitor. Police officer and 2 women were by John O'Keefe. He was on his back about 5 to 6 feet from the road. Doesn't recall about snow on the body. Says John O'Keefe was wearing a hoodie, jeans, and 1 shoe. Not sure which foot, though. Other firefighters checked for his pulse. They started compressions and moving him into the ambulance to get a better look at him and what they were doing. Compressions equal chest CPR. The protocol is early and continuous compressions as long as the person is pulseless, taking breaks to check for pulse or any rhythm changes. They try to switch off every few minutes. He doesn't recall seeing any injuries on John while he was on the ground. In the ambulance, he saw injuries. Initial treatment on the ground was checking for breathing and pulse. There was no pulse. He wasn't breathing. They used a scoop stretcher and then put him on the EMT stretcher. In the ambulance, they observed swollen black and blue right eye, blood around his mouth, cold to the touch, very stiff. He says almost frozen-like. They removed his clothes to examine him for injuries. Cardiac arrest is a lethal cardiac rhythm and no longer having a pulse. They cut off his clothes with trauma shears. He saw lacerations on the right upper arm. They were rewarming with heat blankets and warm fluids. As chest compressions continued in the ambulance, they noticed blood, vomit, or bile coming out of his mouth. Outside of the ambulance, 2 females, white, 35 to 45 years old, average build and height. One had red stuff around her mouth. He thought it could be blood. She was acting kind of erratic and kind of running around, screaming different things. Something like, he's dead, he's fucking dead. Said it at least twice. In the ambulance, In the ambulance care, he, Nuttall, Flamati, Woodbury, Walsh, and McLaughlin came in later, not sure if she did any patient care or not. So he says that it was him, Nuttall, Flamati, Woodbury, and Walsh for sure in the back of the ambulance doing patient care, but he doesn't know if McLaughlin helped. McLaughlin drove the ambulance to Good Samaritan. He was in the back with Nuttall and Flamati on the way to the hospital. He was doing compressions, but they switched him to the automatic CPR machine, so he was helping with ventilation and suction. Nuttall worked on the airway. There were no changes in cardiac activity. They show him the picture of the house. They show him the picture of the house from the flagpole side. Uses the laser pointer to show where John O'Keefe was, and nothing further. This time, cross is done by David Yannetti. He asks about the clothing. He says, jeans, hoodie, one shoe. Matthew Kelly says he never saw the other shoe. He describes trauma shears as large, sharp scissors that are heavy duty. He believes they were used in the ambulance. They took the clothes off to look for the other injuries. Doesn't know who used them, but they used it towards the beginning of the ride. He doesn't recall if both his hoodie and jeans were cut off. The clothing, some stayed on the stretcher with the patient. Some potentially could have ended up on the floor of the ambulance. Protocol for clothing at the hospital is that it gets transferred over to the RN, stays with the patient, usually put in a bag. Doesn't recall who brought in the clothing. Doesn't recall if all clothing was transferred to the RN or some was left in the ambulance. Doesn't know where the RN took the clothes. He went into the treatment room with John O'Keefe. He doesn't recall seeing clothing in the treatment room. He was a fairly new firefighter at the time, only 2 months. His priority was to follow his training. It was fresh in his mind. He and Nuttall got supplies and went to the body. He doesn't know where Flamati was. Flamati, Nuttall, Walsh, McLaughlin, Woodbury, and I think it's Roadbury assisted him in treating John O'Keefe. Not all were involved with the treatment. Some were getting equipment and the stretcher. He recalls that he was doing compressions and helping to suction and ventilate in the ambulance, but doesn't recall who else was partaking in that. When John O'Keefe was put on the scoop stretcher and ultimately taken to the ambulance, he, Nuttall, Flamati were trying to get him on the scoop. The engine guys were trying to get the stretcher, Walsh, Woodbury, and McLaughlin. Doesn't recall who wheeled the stretcher to the ambulance. Doesn't have a clear memory of John O'Keefe going into the back of the ambulance. He, Nuttall, and Flamati, Walsh, and Woodbury went into the ambulance with him. Their priority was to get him warm, so they made a beeline to the ambulance and closed the doors. Says, objection, sustained, and the judge says, let's move it forward. At some point, the doors to the ambulance were closed. At least he, Nuttall, and Flamati were inside the ambulance with the doors closed, and none of those three left. When arriving at the scene, he saw 2 women and a police officer on scene. One woman appeared to have blood around her mouth, something red. He believed she had tried to render CPR. The woman who appeared to have blood around her mouth was the most upset. She was distraught, hysterical, frantic. He heard her say, he's dead, he's fucking dead. She was screaming when she said it. It was very easy for him to discern that her words were, he's dead, he's fucking dead. It was repeated more than once, and at no point in time did he hear her say, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. He's been extremely consistent in his memory of what she said. He told Trooper Proctor the same words and the grand jury the same words. He's never changed his story because the truth does not change. They play a 15-second video clip from Seraph's dash cam audio, and it says, he's dead, he's fucking dead. He says he's not sure what he hears because of all the background noise. He plays it again, and Matthew Kelly says he heard fucking dead. On redirect, let's see. He says you can't see the ambulance in the video. Everyone was doing separate things in separate places, so he may not have heard what someone else heard. They used the shears in the back of the ambulance at the scene prior to leaving, not while the ambulance was in motion. Nothing further, and he is dismissed. And we move on to Francis Walsh, who is a lieutenant firefighter paramedic with the Canton Fire Department. He drove engine 3 to the scene. He arrived on the scene last behind the ambulance. He was responsible for the IO drill that they drilled into his bone to get fluids into him. He left the scene after the ambulance and did not go to the hospital. They go over his experience, certification, education. He worked January 28th, January 29th, 24-hour shift, 8 a.m. to 8 a.m. He was the headquarter engine driver of Engine 3. He also can drive the snowplow on that shift for the station. So he woke up at 4 a.m. because it was snowing heavily, and he started removing snow from the apron of the firehouse. It was very windy and very heavy snow. He was dispatched after 6 a.m. to 34 Fairview for an unresponsive male. Woodbury McLaughlin with him in the engine. Car 5, Captain Robury, and the ambulance also went. There was poor driving conditions and visibility. He doesn't recall ever driving to a call of that severity that slowly. He said he drove extremely slow. He says the order of arrival, Engine 3 got there last, Ambulance 1 and Car 5 were already on the scene. It was a downhill grade. It gets pretty steep. The house was on his left. He saw Ambulance 1, Car 5, a couple of police cruisers there, saw John O'Keefe after arriving. The ambulance was blocking his line of sight. It was pitch black. He walked towards the ambulance. He helped McLaughlin with the stretcher. John O'Keefe was on the backboard the first time he saw him, approximately 10 feet into the road. He placed the stretcher as close to the curb as possible, parallel to the curb. He saw Officers Seraph and Good and 2 female civilians. He had no conversation with the females. He said they were both worked up. One was screaming and crying. They were both frantically moving around. He recalls the one screaming, saying, "Is he alive?" As far as John O'Keefe's clothes, he knows he was missing one shoe on his right foot. He noticed when they put the stretcher in the ambulance because it was right in his face. When John O'Keefe was in the ambulance, he stayed down at the feet by his right leg. In the ambulance, he noticed the hematoma on his right eye, blood coming from his nose. His clothing was removed with trauma shears. On any trauma call, it's protocol to remove clothing to see all injuries and not miss any injuries. He noticed scratches and lacerations on the right arm. He was responsible for the IO drill. It's called an interosseous access drill. I know I messed that up. They do that instead of an IV when someone is in cardiac arrest because it's really hard to get an IV started. So you drill into a bone and you can administer medication and fluids into the bone marrow space. Medical protocol. The frontline medicine for cardiac arrest is epinephrine. The purpose, in layman's terms, it gets the heart pumping again if that's an option. He administered saline to increase the blood volume. He didn't go along on transport to the hospital. He remained on scene very briefly. He talked to Sergeant Good before leaving. He told Sergeant Good there were signs of trauma on the patient, told him about the hematoma on the eye and blood in the nose and scratches and lacerations on the arm. He's shown the picture of the house with the flagpole, uses the laser pointer to show where John O'Keefe was. No further questions. Yannetti does the cross. He says the screaming woman stood out to him because she was the most upset. She was crying more than the others and screaming. He heard her say, "Is he alive?" in loud, distraught voice while she was crying. And there's nothing further. He is dismissed. And then we get to this lady. Wow. Katie McLaughlin. She is a firefighter paramedic with the Canton Fire Department. She was on Engine 3 as what they call a back step. She drove the ambulance that transported John to the hospital. She got John's information from Karen Reed. The judge ended the testimony for the day during her testimony because it was a half day again. Let's see. We go over her experience, education, certification, training. She worked the same shift as everybody else. She was the third person on the engine, which they call a back step. She was at station 1. She was with Frank Walsh, who was the driver, and Lieutenant Greg Woodbury. She woke up at a little before 6, maybe 5 a.m. outside shoveling. The weather, it was snowing, heavy, pretty cold, windy. Shortly after 6 a.m., she was dispatched to a man unresponsive in the snow. Excuse me. It's my phone, sorry. She left within a few minutes, and the ambulance and command car 5 also were dispatched. Car 5 arrived first. Ambulance was in front of them. The engine pulled in behind the ambulance. There were multiple police vehicles and at least one civilian vehicle. She first saw John O'Keefe when she got out of the engine. She went with Walsh to get the stretcher, took it as close as possible as they could to the patient. It was parallel to the curb. That was the first time she observed them working on a patient. The duties of a back step on an engine, she said, it depends on what the lead paramedic needs you to do. Assist ambulance in any way they need, extricating a patient or obtaining info about a patient or bystanders, or assist with patient care if they need you in the back of the ambulance. Tim and Tony were in the area of John O'Keefe. Other people there, but she didn't know who they were. They were several feet away from John O'Keefe with the stretcher. John O'Keefe was on his back. He was secured on the backboard, ready to move to the stretcher. Tony was at the head of the stretcher. She was at the side. There was a woman next to her. Tony said, "Can you try to figure out what happened?" and motioned to a woman by her. She IDs Karen Reed in the courtroom as the person that she talked to. She says that she was very upset, visibly distraught. She asked basic demographic information. How did he get into this situation? Karen Reed said what his name was, his date of birth, some initial medical questions asked. She was very distraught and moving around. Katie McLaughlin asked if there had been any significant trauma that happened prior to this. Karen Reed said, "I hit him." She repeated it. There was a woman sitting across from her who said, "You're hysterical. You need to calm down." Karen Reed repeated, "I hit him." There was a police officer in the vicinity who said, "You what?" Karen Reed repeated it one more time. The officer signaled to somebody and said, "Get Goody down here." She was very upset, hysterical, when she said, "I hit him." She didn't follow up with any questions because she had to drive the ambulance. Because it was said in front of a police officer, she felt the information was appropriately transferred, and based on Karen Reed's demeanor, she didn't think it would be productive to continue asking questions. After hearing the "I hit him," Katie McLaughlin went to the back of the ambulance, relayed that information to Tony, Tim, firefighter Kelly, and firefighter Walsh. McLaughlin didn't assist or partake in any patient care. She noted that John O'Keefe had injuries to his face, blood from his nose and mouth, swelling of his eyes, most notably to the right eye, and a laceration above the right eye. She saw this in the back of the ambulance. She didn't get a good look at him when he was on the stretcher. It was poor visibility. When she was driving the ambulance, she said the roads hadn't been plowed yet, so it took longer than usual to get to the hospital because of the conditions. She said John O'Keefe was wearing jeans, a light zip-up jacket, and one shoe, but doesn't recall which foot. The judge asked to see counsel. They're going to finish with firefighter McLaughlin's testimony, and then they're going to a jury view tomorrow, and court is dismissed. And that takes us to day 4. Get rid of this one. Okay. So she's back on the stand. She has a very spicy cross with Alan Jackson. Her story has evolved over time. She knows Katie Albert, and her testimony, or it's Katie or Caitlin, testimony was halted to voir dire her about her relationship with Caitlin Albert. All right, so we are continuing with direct by Lally. Oh, the dad was back on day 4. She repeats that the clothes were jeans, a dark colored light zip-up jacket, and one sneaker. She said his clothes were soaked through, but she didn't see any holes in his clothes. They show her the picture of the house with the flagpole, give her a laser pointer to show where John O'Keefe was, but she says it's not shown in the picture. It's farther left near a fire hydrant. Nothing further. We have cross with Alan Jackson. When she talked to Karen Reed was moving around the scene going in circles. McLaughlin was wearing a yellow and red firefighter jacket. The questioning began while Karen Reed was moving around, and at one point they came to a stop, and at that point Karen Reed was on her right. That is the point Alan Jackson wants to focus on. That's when McLaughlin recalls the statement made by Karen Reed. In that group, there was Karen Reed to her right, a civilian woman to her left, and a police officer not directly across from her, but maybe diagonal to her, closer to Karen Reed. He shows her a still photo, introduces it as an exhibit. It's a dash cam still, and she says it's the group she just described. She doesn't know the police officer's name. This is when she heard Karen Reed's statement. Jackson says, the first time you ever made that official report to law enforcement regarding that statement was January 30th, 2022, correct? She says, well, yes and no. There was the statement was made in front of the police officer, so that would technically be the first time that statement was made to a police officer in my presence, and then yes, I testified to it on the 30th as we said. Jackson corrects her and says, you said it on January 30th, you weren't testifying under oath. Okay, said it, yes. That's when she met with Trooper Proctor. The events were fresh in her mind. She knew it was important to talk to officers about what she had heard. She wanted to be accurate and as detailed as possible. She agrees that memories get worse with time. Jackson says the statement you made to Trooper Proctor on the 30th, the day after the event, that the statement Karen Reed made was actually to another female, not directly to you, in response to a question. That's what you told Trooper Proctor, correct? She says, I don't have those notes in front of me, so I don't know that I can tell you that's correct, but the statement was made in response to my question. However, the Miss Reed was looking at the woman when she said that. Jackson shows her a highlighted portion of a report to refresh her recollection, and there's a sidebar. They come back, and Jackson says, in fact, what you told Trooper Proctor was, quote, Karen then turned to her friend and stated, I hit him, end quote. Correct? She says, okay. He says, is that a yes? She says, yes. If you're saying that's in quotation marks in there, then yes. Jackson says, that's what's in the report. You don't have to agree with me, but it's a yes or no question, not okay. She says, yes. So in fact, what you told Trooper Proctor was that Karen Reed looked at the female to your left and said 4 times, I hit him. Correct? She says, yes. Jackson says, and have you since learned the name of the female standing to your left? She says, no. He says, you're aware that the female standing to your left made the exact same statement? She says, no. Jackson says, are you aware that the female standing to your left reported the exact same statement as, could I have hit him? Did I hit him? Did I hit him? She says, no, I'm not aware of that. Jackson says, you then went back to the ambulance after hearing that statement that you believe you heard my client state. She says, yes. He says, you opened the ambulance door, the back door. She says, the side door. Nuttall and Flamati were in the ambulance at that time. Jackson says, at that point, you tell them what you believe you just heard. She's like, so I went into the back of the ambulance and I said, this is his name, this is his date of birth. She says he doesn't have any medical history or allergies, doesn't take daily meds. Then I said, she's saying I hit him, and firefighter Nuttall motioned to his face and said something, and then there's an objection. The judge says, ask another question. Jackson says, so the answer to my question is yes. You told in front of Anthony Flamati and Timothy Nuttall the phrase, I hit him. She says, yes. He says, did you write that in any report? She says, I don't write reports in this scenario. My job, so there are two people who will write reports in my department on a call, one being the lead paramedic and the other being the officer who is on the scene. So those are the people who write reports, and I was neither of those, so I did not write a report. I did not write that in a report. That's correct. He says, so let me ask you again, you didn't write it in any report? She says, no. And as you'll notice, she has a hard time with just saying yes or no. Jackson says, you didn't write it in any notes? She says, no. He says, you didn't document that statement in any way whatsoever, correct? She says, other than my interview with Proctor and my subsequent testimony. He says, you didn't document that statement in any way yourself, did you? She says, no. Jackson says, since January 30th and that conversation we just talked about with Trooper Proctor, your statement has evolved. Is that right? She says, I don't know how to answer that. Jackson says, you testified yesterday to something quite different. She says, not quite different. Jackson says, I'm sorry. Then what you stated to Trooper Proctor, she says, respectfully, I think my testimony has been pretty consistent. She's got, I love my daughter-in-law, but when she gets mad at somebody, it's like this Boston girl attitude comes out, and this gal had it. He says, you testified to something yesterday quite different in context than what you told Trooper Proctor. Isn't that right? She raises her eyebrows and shakes her head. She says, I don't know that that's right. And he says, well, you told Trooper Proctor Karen Reed looked at the female standing to your left and said, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him, right? She says, yes. He says, yesterday you told these jurors that Karen Reed said, I hit him, and an officer said, what? And she repeated, I hit him, and the officer immediately turned and went to find another sergeant. She's like, I understand what you're saying, so I understand what you're saying. And he's like, so your story evolved? And she's like, okay, yes. He says, Miss McLaughlin, who's Caitlin Albert? She's like, I went to high school with someone named Caitlin Albert. He goes, with someone named Caitlin Albert? She's like, yeah, I went to high school with someone named Caitlin Albert. He's like, so you do know Caitlin Albert? She's like, I do. Are you friends with Caitlin Albert? I'd say more acquaintances, not close friends. He says, how do you describe acquaintance? I would say that we have mutual friends, so we might see each other occasionally because of mutual friends, but we don't have a one-on-one friendship or hang out regularly. Jackson says, who's her dad? She says, I don't know. There's an objection. Sustained. Jackson says, do you know who her family is? Another objection. Sustained. I think Lally says, may we approach? The judge says, yes. The jury leaves. The judge says, Miss McLaughlin, I'm going to let you step out for a few minutes. And she says, show them what you have to Alan Jackson and let a court officer know when you're ready for me to come back in. And she leaves. Jackson and Lally are standing at the prosecution table looking at some papers. The camera goes to the fucking fan is literally what I wrote down, because if you've watched this at all, when court's like on a break, they normally like they'll show you like the seal of the state or something like that, but no, they go to the ceiling fan and it's on high, and I hate it. The judge comes back and says, okay, Mr. Jackson, let's mark the items you have for identification that you told us about at sidebar. She tells him they are not to be put on the screen. Jackson says, so there are 4 items. One of them, the judge says, don't describe them. I need to see them, so bring them up, mark them for identification, Madam Clerk, and then you'll get them back. But I need these marked for identification, and I need to see them. The judge says, okay, so we have 4 pieces of paper marked for identification that appear you got these off a social media site. He says, that's correct. She's like, okay, when did you get these? He says, I couldn't tell you the exact date, but it's been... Pages are all starting to stick together. But we've probably had them for 6 months to a year. Judge says, all right, Commonwealth, you've not seen these before. Lally says, no, Your Honor. Judge says, all right, so what we'll talk about, Rule 14, in a little bit, but we'll bring the witness in and you can ask her questions, Mr. Jackson, about her vacation that you mentioned and her drinking that you talked about their relationship with Miss Albert and about the house. So you can ask her questions about that, and let's see if you can show you can show her these exhibits marked for identification if you need to. You may have trouble getting those into evidence, but I'm going to let you find out. You can ask her to identify them, how long ago they were taken, things like that. He says, thank you. The judge says, can we bring in Miss McLaughlin, please? Commonwealth says, you objected at sidebar that these come in, or the judge says, Commonwealth, you objected at the sidebar that these came in. And Lally says yes. Sorry, I'm getting all tongue-tied here. McLaughlin's back on the stand. The judge explains that Jackson is going to be allowed to ask her questions outside the presence of the jury. She says, you're still under oath and you have to answer them truthfully. Jackson says, Miss McLaughlin, just briefly, I want to make clear, did you have a conversation with anyone from the Commonwealth between the time you walked out of the courtroom to just now? She says, just about if I needed a drink of water or if I needed to use the restroom. He says, okay, but nothing about the substance of your testimony. She says, no. Miss McLaughlin, I asked you before we broke if you know who Caitlin Albert is. She said, yes. He says, you said that you went to high school with somebody with that name, correct? She says, yes. He says, you in fact know that person as a friend, correct? She says, I know her. He says, she's more than an acquaintance. She's like, I'd say she's an acquaintance. She's not a close friend. She is in a group of friends of yours. She says, we have mutual friends. He says, how long have you known her? She says, probably since high school. He says, when you say, and I'm not going to ask you your age, I wouldn't do that. How many years, a span of years, have you known her? She says, since high school, so maybe 10. He says, and you know her family generally? And she says, I don't. Jackson says, you don't know anything about her family? And she says, I don't know her family. Jackson says, have you ever been to her house? She says, not that I recall ever being there. He says, not that I recall ever being there. He says, not that you recall or you haven't. Those are two different things. She's like, I don't recall ever being there. Jackson says, so you might have been there, you just don't recall. She's like, I don't recall ever being there. He's like, okay, if I were to ask you if you've ever been to her house, yes or no, you cannot answer to that because you don't know. You cannot recall, correct? She's like, I would lean towards no because I have no recollection of being at her house. He says, are you friends with her on social media? She says, yes. He takes the 4 exhibits to McLaughlin and asks her what the first document appears to be. She says, it says Caitlin's friends. He says, does it look like Facebook or one of the social media apps? She says, yeah, I don't know exactly, some sort of social media. He says, under Caitlin's friends, do you see your handle, for lack of a better phrase? She says, I do. He says, okay, is that you? She says, yes. He says, can you look at the next photograph before we talk about the next photograph? How long have you been social media friends with Caitlin Albert? She's like, I don't know. He's like, more than 5 years? She says, probably. He says, more than 8 years? She says, I don't know. The second document appears to be a photograph. Is that correct? She says, yes. Do you see yourself in that photograph? I do. Do you see Caitlin in that photograph? She takes a while to look at it and says, I do. When was that photograph taken? She says, I have no idea. He says, where was that photograph taken? She says, I have no idea. He says, you have no idea how long ago that was? She's like, I don't. He says, what was the event that is depicted in that photograph? She said, I don't know. He says, is that local or was that on a trip somewhere? She's like, I don't know. Well, probably local if it's a beach. I don't remember. I've never been away like to a beach on vacation, but all these people, so probably local. He says, when we talk local, we may have different definitions. Where would that be? What beach? I'm not as familiar with the location. She says, I'm not sure. He says, maybe on the Cape. And she said, possibly. He says, do you recognize some of the other folks that in that photograph? She's like, I do. He says, there's a lot of people in that photograph, aren't there? She says, there's a lot of people in it. He says, did you take a trip with all those people at some point in the past? She's like, take a trip? He's like, to the beach. She's like, did I go to the beach at some point with these people? Yes. He says, when did you go to the beach with all those folks? She's like, I don't know. I don't know when this pic is from. It seems old to me. He's like, well, you can see yourself. She says, yeah. The judge says, what was that? What was that you said? It seems old to you. McLaughlin says, yes, this isn't like a recent to me. Jackson says, how old do you think that photograph is? She's like, I don't know. It could be around high school. I'm not sure. Judge says, and I know Mr. Jackson didn't want to ask how old you were, but when did you get out of high school? She's like, 2014, I graduated. Jackson says, so could that have been around 2014? She says, could be. He's like, so you've known Caitlin for at least that long? She says, yeah. Jackson says, and when I say travel, I mean travel outside of Canton. You've gone places with her. She says, yes. Posed for photographs with her? Yes. With other folks? Yes. Looks like socializing and partying, correct? She's like, looks like socializing. He says, like a small vacation? She's like, I've never been on vacation with a big group of people like this. He says, well, what would you call it? She's like, a day at the beach. Jackson says, a day at the beach? Okay, so maybe a day vacation? She says, sure. A day that's a new one. Let's look at the next photograph. That photograph looks a little older, correct? She says, they both look old to me. I don't know when they're from. Jackson says, I'm going to ask you the same questions about that. These aren't trick questions. Just take your time. What's that from? She's like, I don't remember specifically what or where this was. He says, do you see yourself in that photograph? She says, I do. He says, do you see Caitlin in that photograph? She says she does. He says, you're all posing for the camera, correct? She said, yes. He's like, what's the location? I don't know. He's like, no idea. She's like, I don't. He said, this is yet again another socializing event with Caitlin that you can't recall. She's like, I don't know where this is exactly. He said, so you've had so many socializing events with Caitlin and other folks that you can't pinpoint this one as opposed to any of the others that you've had? She says, no, I'm saying that I can't. These photos are old. I don't know. I don't remember where these were or the circumstances around them is what I'm saying. He says, you see how you're dressed in that photo? She says, yes. He says, you see how the other friends, how they're looking? She says, yeah. He says, how many people would you estimate are in that photo? She says, 12-ish. He says, do you recognize those dozen people? She says, she does. He says, did you go on a day trip with those dozen people? She says, yeah, possibly. He says, when? She says, I don't know. He says, where? She's like, I'm sorry. I don't know. I don't remember. He says, how many times have you gone on day trips with those dozen people? She says, I don't know. He says, how about turning back to photograph I, which was the first photo? How many times have you gone on day trips and socialized with those number of people? It's probably double that, like 20, 25 people. She's like, I don't know. He says, that's a big group of friends of yours that include Caitlin Albert. She says, a big group of mutual friends. He says, so it's not just that she's a mutual friend, she's a friend. Is that right? She says, as I said before, I would consider myself more of an acquaintance. We have mutual friends. I wouldn't consider her a close friend, but yeah, I mean, that would be my answer. He says, you basically grew up with her, went to high school with her. She's like, I didn't grow up with her. I went to high school with her. He says, when I say grow up with her, I mean, you grew up in the same town as her. She's like, we grew up in the same town. He says, went to the same high school as she did. She says, yes. He says, socialized with the same friends as she did. She says, yes. Went on day trips with her. Yes. And apparently have all the same friend group. She says, I don't know that we have all the same friend group. These are people that we're both friends with. He says, but you don't consider her anything more than an acquaintance. She says, I think I described it to you. He says, the answer to my question is you don't consider her anything more than an acquaintance. She says, I wouldn't consider her to be a close friend. He says, now let's take a look at the last photograph. Describe what's in that photograph. She says, it's a picture of me. Caitlin is in it, and there seems to be other people in it as well. He says, that's a close-up photograph of who? She's like, Caitlin, and I'm also in it. He says, and you are doing what in that photograph as it relates to Caitlin? She says, it seems like I'm kind of kneeling down next to her. Jackson says, touching her? Judge asks to see it for just a minute. Ask McLaughlin, Can you show me you? She points to her in the picture. The judge hands it back. Just for the record, may I approach one more time, Your Honor? He takes the photo and looks at it and hands it back. Jackson says, you're sort of just behind Caitlin in that photograph. She says, yes. Caitlin is the one drinking the beer. She says, yes. He says, you've got your right arm around her. She's like, yes. He says, you both appear to be wearing swimwear. She says, yes. He says, bathing suit? She says, yes. And you're giving someone a sign with your left hand. She's like, no, I'm not. He says, is that someone else's hand I saw? Maybe that's Caitlin. She said, yeah. He says, looks like that's a photograph that you and Caitlin posed for together. She says, it seems like it's a close-up of a bigger photo. It seems to be zoomed in on a group of people. Jackson says, that was posted on social media. She says, okay. He's like, right? She's like, are you telling me that? He says, I'm asking you that. Have you ever seen that posted on social media? She says, I don't recall seeing this picture, but if it was on social media, then okay. Jackson says, how long ago was that picture taken? She says she doesn't know. He asks who took the picture. She says she doesn't know. Where were you when the photograph was taken? She said probably at a beach with, if we're wearing bathing suits, probably at a beach or a beach. She's like, well, I can't see the beach in the pic. We're in the bathing suits. It could be a beach. Jackson says, do you recognize the bathing suit you're wearing in the photograph? She says, no. He's like, you literally don't even recognize your own outfit. She says, no. Jackson says, so that doesn't help define where you were when that photograph was taken. She says, no, sir. He says, do any of these photographs remind you that you've been to Caitlin's house at some point in your friendship with her? She says, no. Has Caitlin ever been to your house? She says, not to my recollection. He said, when's the last time you talked to Caitlin? She's like, I don't remember exactly. It's probably been a few years. He says, when is the last time you went to an event, a socializing event with Caitlin? She's like, again, I don't remember exactly. He says, did you talk to Caitlin at any point at or around, on or around January 29th, 2022? She says, no. He says, when was the last time you talked to Caitlin prior to January 29th, 2022? She says, I don't know. He says, a day before, a week before, a month before. She's like, no, I don't talk to her. Like I said, we're not like close friends. So it's like pretty infrequent that we would interact. So I don't know when the last time before that. He says, what about texting or Snapchatting or communicating in that way? She says, I don't remember. He says, would it have been a week before the 29th? She says, I don't think so. Jackson says, you don't think so or you know so? She's like, I don't think so. Jackson says, what about after the 29th? After you responded to 34 Fairview, remember having any communication with her? She says, not that I can recall. He says, so is that something that you think you might remember if you responded to the house of the father where there's a police officer dead or dying on the front yard on the lawn 30 feet from the front door? You might have had a conversation with Caitlin. She says, I've never had a conversation with Caitlin about that call or this case. He said, did you ever contact any of your other friends about the fact that you responded to Caitlin's parents' house? She says, no. He says, were you ever asked about this relationship that you had with Caitlin Albert, this friendship you had with Caitlin Albert at or near the time of the 29th of January? She says, no. He says, did you ever disclose to anybody that you had a relationship with Caitlin Albert at or around the time of this event? She says, no. He says, when you went to 34 Fairview, you knew that was the Albert family home, correct? She says, no. He says, when did you learn that it was the Albert, you now know that? She's like, yes, I now know that. He said, when did you find that out? She's like, I don't know. I don't recall. It was some point after it, but I don't know when. He said, would it have been the next day? She said, no. He says, you and firefighter Flamati and firefighter Nuttall were all discussing this case pretty intently after this event, correct? She says, no. Jackson says, it's not that often that in the little town of Canton that a PO is found, police officer is found dead or dying on another police officer's lawn. Wouldn't you agree with that? She says, we responded to a medical call, so the convo after that was at the hospital, debriefing the call, going over what happened. what we used for equipment, what we need, and sorry, my handwriting is so bad, what we need, and that was the extent of the conversation. He says, would you agree that this case, given its notoriety, is discussed at the fire station almost daily? She says, I don't know when I'm not there, but it does get brought up. He says, and obviously the fact that the house belongs or belonged at the time to the Albert family is part of the discussion. She says, I don't know, like I said, it gets brought up, but I just avoid it. I don't engage in the conversations. He says, it was certainly enough of a subject matter that you learned after the 29th that the home belonged to Brian Albert, Nicole Albert, the parents of your friend Caitlin Albert, right? She says, well, at that point, it was on the news consistently. So I don't know where, like, that info was introduced. But he says, but it was pretty early on after the 29th. She says, I don't recall when it was known that that was the case. He says, and you didn't learn that was the Albert family home last week? She says, no. At this point, Paul O'Keefe is giving major dirty looks to the defense, like if looks could kill, Jackson would be dead. Jackson says, you've known for going on 2.5 years. She says, I don't know exactly when I learned that that was the house. He says, I know you don't realize exactly when, Miss McLaughlin. I'm not asking you on what date you learned. I'm asking, basically, you knew this throughout the lifetime of this case. She says, at some point after I learned it. He says, right, I'm just trying to figure out about how long after, a week after, a month after. She says, I'm not sure. He says, but it was more towards January 29th than it was yesterday, correct? She says, correct. He asks if she knows any of Caitlin's siblings. She says, no. He says, you don't know Brian Albert Jr.? She says, no. Do you know any of her extended family that might be closer in age to you? Like Colin Albert? She says, no. He says, you've never met any of them? She's like, not that I recall. He says, you don't recall or no? She says, I don't remember meeting any of them. He says, Your Honor, that's all I have right now. Lally has a few questions. He says, so, Miss McLaughlin, you're not friends with Karen Albert, correct? She says, I would say she's an acquaintance, not a close friend. Lally clarifies with her that she doesn't know when or where pictures were taken. Again, she says they seem old. She saw Caitlin Albert more in high school because they were there every day. She never hung out or socialized with Caitlin Albert outside of a large group. The judge says, why don't we wrap this up, Mr. Lally? He's basically repeating Alan Jackson's questions. The judge says there's been an objection to allowing these photos in as it's in violation of Rule 14. Is that correct, Mr. Lally? He says, yes. Judge says, I agree, so exhibits don't come in, but based on the voir dire, I'm going to let you have a little leeway on what you did as far as the relationship, the socialization, and the extent of it, friends on social media, those areas. She has a sidebar. The jury comes back in. We go back to the cross with Alan Jackson. He says, you and Karen Albert have known each other for how long? She says, since high school. He says, give me a span of time. She says, about 10 years. She says she's traveled, taken day trips with Caitlin Albert and groups of friends on more than one occasion. They have mutual friends with Caitlin Albert on social media. She saw 3 photos of her with Caitlin Albert. She said there's probably been more events together without photos. Today she knows that Caitlin Albert is the daughter of Brian and Nicole Albert and that Caitlin Albert has siblings. And as of today, she knows 34 Fairview was the Albert home on January 29th, 2022. She didn't recognize that as the home of Caitlin Albert. The statement she gave to Trooper Proctor is not the same as what she said yesterday. Jackson says, when you made this statement to Trooper Proctor, your visit to Canton Police Department was coordinated by another officer to bring you and Proctor together for the interview, correct? She says, I don't recall that. He says, do you remember being contacted by a completely different officer to say, hey, Trooper Proctor wants to talk to you. Come on into the Canton PD to have an interview. She says, I don't remember how the interview was set up. He says, you have no recollection of the officer who the officer was that set that up. She says, I don't. He says, does the name Kevin Albert sound familiar? She says, no. He says, do you know Kevin Albert? She says, no. He says, do you know him to be a police officer at the Canton Police Department? She says, no. He says, do you know him to be the brother of Brian Albert? She says, I don't. There's an objection. It's sustained. Jackson says that's all he's got. We've got redirect with Lally. He says that her and Caitlin Albert aren't close friends. They're more like acquaintances. She agrees. She has probably 500 friends on social media, but she considers much less than those 500 to be actual friends. She talked to Caitlin Albert more in high school because they were there every day. She graduated in 2014. Doesn't know when or where those photos were taken. The day trips to the beach with a large group of people were taken to the beach with a large group of people. She didn't know Caitlin Albert before high school. They talk about how it's common to work as a civil servant in the town you live in. She's been on calls with places or people she's familiar with or knew before. She says that's not a reason to not go on a call. She's obligated to respond to calls. When on duty, there's an objection sustained. Judge says ask the question differently. Lally says, as far as when you're on duty, you get a call. What, if any, choice do you have to respond to any particular call? She says, I don't have a choice. I just have to respond to the call. She says she's never spoken to Caitlin Albert about what happened on that morning. Recross, Alan Jackson has 2 questions. They're both objected and sustained. She's dismissed. Then they go on the jury view of 34 Fairview Road. The attorneys and the judge are going, and the jury is not allowed to take notes or photos. So this is the house now. The Alberts no longer own it, and that is Karen Reed's car in front of the house. These are just some pictures of her car that a pool photographer took that went along. You can see some of the, the damage, the taillights missing, whatever. And then this is just kind of a view of looking at the house from the fire hydrant angle. And then at the bottom, I added that one in there to show you that everybody keeps talking about the curb, but there isn't an actual curb. All right, then they come back and we move on to Greg Woodbury. He's a lieutenant firefighter paramedic with the Canton Fire Department. He said he was lieutenant on engine 4, but everyone else has said it was engine 3 that went. He forgot John O'Keefe's name on the stand. Literally forgot his name on the stand. Says he was nervous. He manages people, make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. He didn't go to the hospital, and he was dispatched on the second call for Karen Reed. Goes over his experience, education, training, certification. He worked the same shift as everybody else. He got up about 5 a.m. because of the snowstorm, had to shovel, blizzard-like conditions, decent amount of snowfall, 2 to 3 inches on the ground at the time. The judge, thank God, finally says, I think we can move quickly through this part. In my opinion, because we've heard the same shit before from every single witness. He says he was lieutenant on engine 4. He got dispatched, or there was a dispatch for a person in the snow. He went with McLaughlin and Walsh. Ambulance went also. He doesn't remember the address, but it wasn't too far away. Upon arrival, he saw the police were already there. Several people were off to the side in the yard doing something. It was on his left-hand side, or it was on the left-hand side of the street. He went to evaluate the patient. Someone had started CPR prior to them getting there, so they continued that. He doesn't know who started the CPR, but it was someone outside of their department. He couldn't see John O'Keefe until he exited the vehicle. That's when he literally could not remember his name on the stand, and he says he's nervous and blanking. John O'Keefe was on his back, parallel to the street, about 8 feet from a snowbank. John O'Keefe was covered with snow, and there was snow around him. He started CPR immediately. He went to get the board so they could get John O'Keefe onto that to get him on the stretcher, to get him in the ambulance. Someone else was trying to get the backstory, trying to figure out the scenario they were dealing with. Oh, he said they did CCR, and he says the difference between CPR and CCR. CPR is cardiopulmonary resuscitation when you're helping someone breathe. CCR is when they first get to a scene. They don't have to give respirations right away. Apparently the protocols have changed. They can just do compressions. It's a little more effective to get the blood pumping quickly. He assisted with CPR and made sure everyone was doing their task. As lieutenant, he has to manage everyone and make sure they're doing what they're supposed to. John O'Keefe wasn't breathing. He had no pulse. In the ambulance, they stripped off his clothes. He's not sure if they cut them off or pulled them off. He wasn't paying attention to what John O'Keefe was wearing. The injuries were a hematoma or bruising of the right eye. It was very prominent. He had some scratches on his right forearm, mostly external injuries that they noted. Some other civilians were there, but he wasn't really paying attention to them. McLaughlin obtained the backstory. McLaughlin said someone had hit him and he was last seen at, and there's an objection sustained, and the judge says that will be stricken. There's a sidebar. They go to lunch. Law and Crime shows the footage from the jury view. We come back. Direct continues with Lally. He said he was paying attention to CPR with hyperthermic cardiac arrest. A patient takes longer because you have to warm them up. So clothes are removed quickly and you're not really paying attention to them. He says they can't declare them dead until they're warmed up. Hypothermic patients can appear dead but are actually still alive. After 2 minutes, they swap off because doing chest compressions is very tiring. He stayed with the engine. The other 2 people went with the ambulance. He went back to the station. A little while later, he was sent back to the same address on Fairview. He had firefighter Sam Pock drive. They responded back with engine 4 with an ambulance from station 2. Jason Becker and Dan Whitley were on that ambulance. This call was for a section 12, which is someone having a psychological issue. This was for Karen Reed. Police were still on the scene. He spoke to the police officer but doesn't know who it was. He talked to Karen Reed. He points to her in the courtroom. Karen Reed was in the vicinity of the police cars. A section 12 is when someone threatens harm to themselves or others, so he had to evaluate her mental ability at the time and determine if she was a threat to them or herself. He said she was very distraught, very upset. He tried to explain to her about going to the hospital and the section 12. Initially, she was resistant and she didn't want to go to the hospital. She didn't think she needed any assistance. He said they're required to transport to the hospital once the police write a section 12. You have to be evaluated at a hospital. He said he knew Karen Reed had a strong relationship with John O'Keefe, but he didn't know married, engaged, or what the status was. She kept repeating, "Is he dead? Is he dead?" She seemed very concerned about that. They tried to explain they can't declare him dead, and he's being evaluated and treated. She was very up and down. Conversation was repetitive with her. She was obviously experiencing a lot of different emotions. Her emotional state was all over the place. The second time on the scene, he was there approximately 15 to 20 minutes. If someone goes voluntarily to the hospital, they usually get released quicker. The ambulance took Karen Reed to Good Samaritan. He detailed Sam Pock to be the driver. Nothing further. Yannetti does cross. He says his main interaction with Karen Reed was on the second call to the scene. The section 12 was his focus. He said basically they were telling her we can do this the easy way or the hard way. They tried to persuade Karen Reed to do it the easy way and go voluntarily. She agreed to go. She was grief-stricken, hysterical at times, raising her voice and crying at times. Didn't see actual tears, but that kind of emotional display. He said he only heard Karen Reed say repeatedly, "Is he dead? Is he dead?" regarding John O'Keefe. He shows him an exhibit picture. It is John O'Keefe's right arm. Let me see. I've got a picture of that for you. They call a sidebar. He said there's no lividity on John O'Keefe. Cuts weren't just on the forearm, some were above the elbow as well, consistent with the picture. And he is excused. And real quick, I want to show you some of the pictures that they were talking to Katie McLaughlin about. This is the one where they were drinking the beer. This was the beach picture. And then somebody posted this. Apparently, allegedly, take it with a grain of salt. When her friends saw her basically lie on the stand about her relationship with Caitlin Albert, they came out in droves and people started posting pictures, basically documenting that they've been friends, close friends for a long time. This picture shows they ran cross country together in high school. And this is just an example of more pictures that people were posting and what people were talking about online. It got a little crazy. Okay. So we are back here. Back down here. Okay. Next, we have Daniel Whitley. He is a firefighter paramedic with Canton Fire Department, assigned to Ambulance 2 as the field training officer. He was dispatched for the Section 12 of Karen Reed. He got her medical history. He knows Terry Roberts. He lived across from the O'Keefes. He knew who John O'Keefe was, and he escorted Karen Reed to the psych hall in the hospital. Let's see. They did, his experience, what shift, same as everybody else. He was assigned to Ambulance 2 as the field training officer with Becker. At 6:41, they were dispatched to where there was an earlier call for CPR, man in the snow. It was a Section 12 at the same address. It was snowing heavily. The ambulance nearly slid off the road, turning onto Fairview. Engine 3 and 2 police cruisers and a gray SUV were on the scene. Lieutenant Woodbury and Sam Pock were there. Police officer Mulaney and Seraph. 2 civilian females. 2 females near the SUV. 3 females there. So I'm like, did you see 2 or did you see 3? I don't know. Karen Reed was the patient. He IDs her in the courtroom. He talked to Woodbury and Pock first, then Officer Mulaney and Seraph. You got the patient story, then everyone else's story. Karen Reed was very upset, kept saying, I don't want to live anymore if my husband dies. I don't want to live anymore. They said that aligns more with normal grieving process when something traumatic happens to a loved one, whether they die or not. They didn't feel like it led to the level of a Section 12 transport to the hospital. He went to talk to Sarah, told him they needed more than if my husband dies, I want to die, because that seemed like just normal grieving things. She was very upset. She kept asking if the patient transported in Ambulance 1 was alive or dead. They said, we can't speak to that. She asked if someone could be alive in the snow without a jacket for many hours. They tried to give her hope that whoever was transported in Ambulance 1 was still alive. They talked about hypothermia cases where people were under cold water for long periods and survived with no neurological deficits. She identified John O'Keefe as her husband many times. Conversations with Karen Reed were in the back of an ambulance with him and firefighter Becker. Becker was lead tech on the Section 12. When you have a Section 12, 2 EMTs are in the back with the patient at all times. She would have episodes where she'd go from crying in her hands to perking up. She talked about having to take care of kids and how she couldn't do it. Karen Reed said, I can't do it. These aren't my kids. They're not his kids. She asked if he knew Carrie Roberts, and he said he did. After he said that she seemed to have a good support system, Karen Reed said anyone who knows Carrie Roberts wouldn't say that. This took him aback. It seemed strange to say something like that after you're just crying because your husband is dead. When she described the situation with the kids, he realized it was John O'Keefe in Ambulance 1 because in the neighborhood he grew up in Canton, John O'Keefe was known to have taken in his niece and nephew after his sister and brother-in-law passed away, and it was something people admired him for and looked up to him for. The O'Keefes lived directly across from him. He never had any interaction with them. And then there's an objection to this line of questioning. It was sustained. She tells him to move on. Says he knows Carrie Roberts because she lives around the corner from him. There's another objection. The judge says, I'll allow that. He's known her because she throws the neighborhood block party. She wanted the fire engine there, so he brought it. She was one of the other females on the scene. His conversation with Karen Reed in the ambulance was like 20 to 25 minutes. Her tone was almost despondent to when she talked about Carrie Roberts. She was almost snarky. Yannetti moves to strike that, and the judge strikes that. At Good Samaritan, Karen Reed asked to see John O'Keefe. He asked the ER doctor if the wife could see the husband. The doctor asked if she would be upset. He said she's going to be upset either way. The ER doctor wanted to know if she'd get in the way of the resuscitation efforts, and he said it's possible because she's very upset. And they escorted Karen Reed to the psych hall or behavioral hall, and they stayed with her at least 10 minutes. She was giving nurses a hard time about getting into a Johnny, I'm assuming it's like a gown, I don't know, about giving a urine sample. They waited until security got there before they left. Nothing further. Then we have Cross with Yannetti. He says medical history is important to pass along to the hospital in case something happens and patient can't give full medical history. He took the medical history from Karen Reed. Jason took the medical history from Karen Reed. Yannetti shows him Jason Becker's report and a report from Butnick. Becker's report was first. The medical history says that she has multiple sclerosis, which is a progressive disease. Nothing further. He's excused. Then we get Jason Becker, another firefighter paramedic with Canton Fire Department, assigned to Ambulance 2 as lead tech on the call, dispatched for Section 12 of Karen Reed. He had to write a report about the call, and he's made inconsistent statements. We have direct with Lally, same crap again, education, what shift, what was the weather like. Says he was aware of the 6 a.m. call for Station 1. And then at 6:41, his station got dispatched for a psych eval. Possible Section 12. Engine 3 was Woodbury and Pock. They went 2. On this call to Fairview Road, Whitley was the driver. He was the lead tech. He had to write the report. He shows him the engine report and his report. He said on arrival, he saw police lights, fire engine, black SUV parked to the left of... They parked to the left of the SUV, and the SUV was facing them. He first spoke to Seraph and Mulaney. He walked to the SUV. There were 2 females. He IDs Karen Reed in the courtroom as one of the females. He says she was in the front passenger seat. He had been briefed that she was the wife of the previous patient. One of the Canton police officers said it. He asked Karen Reed what was going on. She was distraught. Said the previous statement she made she didn't mean. It was about the current situation she was going through. Said she had just done CPR on her husband. Conversation in the vehicle lasted approximately 10 minutes. Then they moved to the ambulance. Karen Reed was asking if he was dead. Could he be dead more than once? Was repetitive. She had blood on her mouth, neck, and chin. She said she made prior statements because she had seen her husband dead. She had no plans to act on them. Her vitals were normal. Her heart rate was normal. It was a little high, but not concerning. She had periods of calmness, then agitation because she didn't want to go to the hospital. At times, she was cooperative. Eventually, she agreed to go with them. During the transport, Karen Reed said she didn't know if she'd be able to take care of the children. She was worried about who would take care of the children if John was pronounced dead. Karen Reed said she and John had gotten into an argument. She was sad because the last thing she had said to him was the argument. He didn't know who the other female in the SUV was, later learned that it was Carrie Roberts. He asked if she had taken any drugs or alcohol. She denied it. She was cooperative and calm, then eventually got a little agitated and with, I don't know what this means, but he said with competitive questions. She seemed distraught. With regards to John, she asked, is he dead? Could he be dead? And could I have hit him? Somewhat repetitive statements. Karen Reed said she didn't mean the statements in reference to suicidal statements. And he has nothing further. Yannetti does cross. Becker says, I don't know if she had had alcohol the night before, but at the time he asked Karen Reed the question, she said she hadn't had any. He didn't specify within a certain time period. He was asking about that point in time an hour or two before. This was at 6:40 a.m. He didn't smell any alcohol on her. She didn't say she had had alcohol the night before. When he was interviewed by Trooper Proctor on February 14th, 2022, 2 weeks after the event, his memory would have been much better than it is today. He told Trooper Proctor that she did consume alcohol last night. Objection. Sidebar. Doesn't recall if he told Trooper Proctor that. Shows him Trooper Proctor's report. He asks him to read a highlighted part. That refreshes his memory. He says he did tell Trooper Proctor that. At times, Karen Reed's speech was very rapid. She was fixated on if he was dead, asked it repeatedly. Karen Reed didn't give any detail about her last interaction with her husband, didn't specify if it was in person, communication, phone, text, or angry voicemail she left. Nothing further. Witnesses excused, court dismissed. Monday will be a full day. Damn. All right. That's what I got for you. Thank you so much for hanging in here with me. And please give this a like, share, subscribe. That would be great. Just get this out in the algorithm. Here I just have some other discrepancies where one says he's dressed for the weather, several layers, was adamant he was wearing a puffy coat, underdressed for the weather, long sleeve shirt and jeans, hoodie jeans, one shoe, missing a right shoe, jeans light zip up jacket, one shoe, wasn't paying attention, and there's the picture from the bar the night before she dropped him off at the party, so you can see what he's wearing. And then, what did she say? I hit him. Oh my God, I hit him. He's dead. He's fucking dead. Is he dead? I hit him. Wasn't paying attention. And then a few other that I picked up on. They don't agree on if or how much snow was on John O'Keefe. They don't agree on where he was, like how far off the road. They don't agree on who did chest compressions during CPR. They don't agree on the number of females at the scene. Most say 2, some say 3, some don't know. And most of them have changed their statements at least once. So there you go. I will continue to follow this. I will give you some updates. I'm working on another case right now as well. Yeah, like I said, thanks for hanging in here with me. And please like, share, and subscribe. And I will see you all in the next one. Bye.